Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 5th annual Georgian Bay Healthcare, Wellness, Research, and Innovation Day. My name is Dr. Michael Lisi, and I am the Chief of Staff at Collingwood General Marine Hospital and the facilitator for today's event. This event is a collaboration between Collingwood General Marine Hospital, the Rural Ontario Medical Program, Georgian College, as well as the Town of Collingwood, the Town of the Blue Mountains, Wasaga Beach, and Clearview Township. Some of our goals here today are to give you an opportunity to learn and explore some of the great research and initiatives taking place locally in Southern Georgian Bay. Typically, this event has been hosted live at CGMH. As you are all aware, due to COVID-19 and physical distancing, we have adapted to this event to a virtual live stream platform so that we may continue to share knowledge and innovation from within our community. For those of you who attended this event in the past, you will recall we had a large display of research posters lining the halls of the hospital. This year, these posters are available online at the cgmh.on.ca and romponline.com websites. You can see those listed there. It is our hope that you will browse through these posters, which highlight the outstanding work being done in this area, and reach out virtually to have further conversations about local innovative research. We are very excited that you are all able to join us, and I want to thank those who have logged into the live stream to participate in today's event. If you have any specific questions for the speakers, please use the chat box below the live stream on the ROMP website. Our focus for Research Day this year is COVID-19. The ongoing global pandemic has impacted us all personally and professionally over the past few months. Today's Research Day theme is extremely topical and hopefully will answer some questions you may have, as well as prompt you to think about healthcare moving forward as we continue to adapt and manage amidst COVID-19. Just before we get started, I want to thank a few individuals who helped to make today happen. From our partners, Martin Ridlow from the Town of Collingwood, Mayor Doug Measures from Clearview Township, the Town of Blue Mountains, Dr. Peter Wells and Michelle Hunter from the Rural Ontario Medical Program, Jacqueline Limoges, Marilyn Houghton, and Veronique from Georgian College, and our team here at CGMH. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Our first speaker of the day is Dr. Ashley Twitt, an infectious disease epidemiologist, mathematical modeler, and assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Dalai Lama School of Public Health. Her research focuses on integrating data with mathematical models to study the epidemic spread of communicable diseases and identify optimal intervention and control strategies. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto and was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She also worked as an epidemiologist and modeling lead at Blue Dot, a public health startup that seeks to anticipate and contextualize infectious disease risks.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just start by sharing my screen with you all. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I am an epidemiologist and mathematical modeler. And as the COVID-19 pandemic has spread, I think that mathematical modeling in general has really come to the forefront in terms of the COVID response, and also in terms of a lot of the conversation around what is coming and what we might expect in the future. And so I think in general, we've become much more familiar with terminology in terms of communicable disease epidemiology. And what I was hoping to do today was to just quickly give you an overview of what mathematical modeling is, and talk about how me and my collaborators are using it to quantify, forecast, and communicate risk and uncertainty in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I wanted to just start by, telling you that, when I tell people that I'm a mathematical modeler, sometimes they feel intimidated because there's the word math in what I do. But the reality is that everybody is a modeler. The way that we navigate the world is we build models, whether they be mental models or physical models, about how we think the world works. And so these are really just simplified versions of reality that we can use to test our assumptions about how processes unfold, or help us understand if we're making a decision, what are the different potential outcomes. So not all modelers use math. This is an example of a chocolate model. So someone's built a physical model of what the coronavirus looks like. I think we've all become familiar with the idea of flattening the curve and how we want to use that as an approach to minimize the impact of COVID in our population. And again, this is a model. This is a model where we sort of we use our understanding of how diseases spread and think about how we can minimize its impact in our population. The type of models that I use are, as I said, they require a little bit of math, but the really sort of fundamental concept is that you have a population that, in the case of a pandemic, everyone in the population starts out as susceptible, and then they transition to becoming infected and infectious to others, and ultimately recover, and they may die as well. And you can make these models incredibly complex, and include additional transitions in terms of clinical outcomes, as well as including information on how people interact and how they sort of age structure and different occupations. But fundamentally, all models, when we're talking about communicable disease models, tend to have this really basic structure behind them. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about a concept that's really important in modeling and in communicable disease epidemiology in general, and that's what's called the basic reproduction number. And so the basic reproduction number is for a disease where the entire population is susceptible, the average number of new cases generated by each index case. And in the case of COVID-19, we think that the basic reproduction number is somewhere between 2 and 3. So in this illustration, I'm using a number of 3. And so that means that initial case is making 3 cases. And then each of those 3 cases go on to make 3 more cases. This happens generation after generation. And what we experience is exponential growth. So for any communicable disease where the reproduction number is above 1, we're going to see an epidemic. We're going to see exponential growth. And that's really what makes outbreaks so scary. The reason that we focus so much on the basic reproduction number is because we can use it to think about how we can control a disease. So ultimately, the goal of communicable disease control is how do we get this number as low as possible so that on average, each old case is making ideally no new cases, but at least 1 or fewer new cases. So we don't have that typical epidemic curve that we see for diseases that spread uncontrolled in a population. And so there are 3 components that go into the reproduction number. The first is how long is a person sick and able to infect other people? So this is the infectious period of a disease. The second is how many people does that sick person come into contact with while they're sick? So this is the contact pattern. So how many people do you see on a typical day? And then the final piece of the R0 is what is the probability that the sick person infects a healthy person if they do come into contact? So just because you come into contact with somebody doesn't mean that you're going to infect them. There is some probability that you will transmit to other people, and that varies depending on the particular pathogen and how it's spread. So for example, for a sexually transmitted infection, the probability that a sick person infects a healthy person requires a very different type of contact than for an airborne or droplet-borne disease. And so the reason that I wanted to highlight these different components is because if you look at these and you think about them, all of the public health interventions that we use are basically trying to change components of the basic reproduction number. So, when we talk about how many people does the sick person come into contact with while they're feeling ill, you can think about what we've done in terms of physical distancing is we're trying to minimize those contacts so that if somebody is sick, they're coming into contact with fewer people, and that can help bring the reproduction number lower. So just to sort of reiterate that and come back to our schematic, this is what the same disease may look like when we start implementing different public health control measures. So in this case, we have this initial case. They're practicing good hand hygiene. And so even though this person is exposed to this infectious individual, they don't become infected. So this case never happens. And then all of these downstream cases are also averted because of that initial intervention. Similarly, this other person became sick and wasn't feeling well and decided to stay home. So they still infected one other person, but they've reduced the number of people who have these downstream infections. And so that's really important. And that's really, this is a little bit of a simplified overview of how disease transmission works, but it's really the sort of bread and butter of the type of work that we do in public health in terms of thinking about how do we break those chains of transmission. So myself and my collaborators have been doing a fair amount of modeling, trying to anticipate what would have happened in Ontario. So we built a mathematical model that incorporates information on the age structure of the Ontario population and how people interact with each other. Also incorporated some of the expected outcomes in terms of probability of a case requiring hospitalization or ICU care or an infection resulting in death. And so with this model, what we were able to do is fit it to data. So in both of these graphs, you'll see there are some black circles there, and those represent the available data from Ontario. The top graph is showing the number of cases in ICU per 100,000 population, and the bottom graph is showing the cumulative number of deaths per 100,000 population. And the blue lines are showing our model. So we built a model and we fit it to the available data. And this is our model fit to what happened in Ontario over the past couple months. And what's shown in gray is what our model predicts would have happened had we not intervened as we did in early March. So what you'll note is that this dashed line is showing our ICU capacity. And according to our models, we would predict that ICU capacity in a number of model simulations. So there's a bit of uncertainty there to capture some of the unknowns that we have in terms of how this disease spreads in the population. But on average, we would expect that our ICU capacity would have been overwhelmed by the end of May. Similarly, the number of deaths that we would have seen would have been about 5-fold higher than what we did actually see. So the take-home message here is that we can use models to basically show these counterfactual scenarios or parallel universes and say, we have what we observed in the population in terms of understanding how many cases we see, but what would have happened had we not done anything? And what we show here is that we did, the response that we had did save lives. Moving forward, I think at this point, we're starting to think about what comes next. And so what we did using our model was we showed what we would expect to happen if we removed the physical distancing measures that we have in place in the absence of having some compensatory measures. In the absence of these control measures, we're very, very susceptible to resurgence. And the speed with which the disease resurges really depends on how much we relax physical distancing. So our sort of best case scenario here is we have about half a year until ICU capacity would be exceeded if we return to about 50% of our normal day-to-day contacts with other people. So I wanted to just quickly talk a little bit about contact tracing. So, obviously we had some pretty strong measures in place since March. I think everybody agrees that those were suboptimal and we don't want to go back to that. So the question is, what do we do to compensate? And our major tact right now is to focus on testing, contact tracing, and isolating infected people. So just in terms of terminology here, a case investigation is when we contact people who have tested positive for COVID-19 and interview them about their contacts. And then contact tracing is finding those contacts. So using the information that we elicit from this original index case, to try and identify all of these contacts and ask them to stay home for 14 days, monitor for symptoms, and follow up with these individuals frequently. An important piece of all of this is that you need to support people so that they can and will self-isolate in terms of, making sure that people have food, medicine, childcare space, and so on. And I've heard this sort of process described as, requiring job skills that are both a detective, a social worker, and a healthcare advisor. It's a pretty complicated responsibility in terms of making sure that people do have the ability to do this, to make sure that they have access to testing and can comply with the recommendations. Oops. We've had the chance to look at some data from Ontario, looking at what the contact tracing process looks like. So for this to work, what we're basically trying to do is get those index cases, find their contacts, get them to self-isolate before they can go on to transmit to other people. So we're trying to break chains of transmission. And the really important part of this is, first of all, you need to be testing a lot of those initial cases. And you also need to be finding their contacts really quickly. So COVID spreads very fast. And so if your contact tracing process takes too long, you're actually not going to find those subsequent cases in time to prevent this, to break these chains of transmission. And I don't want to get too bogged down with this figure, but basically what we're showing here is that blue are the percentage of cases that of contacts that we think would have been found in time to isolate them before they become infectious. So a lot of the cases of a lot of the contacts that we're finding will have already gone on to become infectious by the time we find them. So this is a bit of a problem in Ontario right now, where we have this pipeline that's rather slow. And so if we don't improve that, we're going to have a hard time relying on test and trace as a strategy to control the epidemic. So I just wanted to, I'm going to wrap up here quickly, just say that, we've done some more modeling work to look at how good contact tracing needs to be in Ontario for it to compensate for the reduction in physical distancing. And so this is based on a model that's put out by a group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and this is the reference for that. And basically, our take-home message here is we're looking at what the effective reproduction number is. So how many new cases is each old case making in the presence of physical distancing when we have different levels of initial case finding. So that's shown on the x-axis here. And when we have different probabilities that those contacts of the cases are found rapidly. So higher probabilities of either finding a symptomatic case and finding their contacts means that we're doing better in terms of the test and trace strategy. So the top bright quadrant here is sort of the best that we could potentially do. And what we see is that when we have strong physical distancing in place, it doesn't really matter how good we are at testing and tracing, because the basic reproduction number is almost always expected to be below 1. So here blue is good. Blue means that we have the reproduction number below 1. The challenge is that when we relax physical distancing, so as we move up the graph here, we have less and less levels of physical distancing. And you'll note that there's a lot of red there. And basically what that means is that when we take away physical distancing, having sustained control of COVID-19 by testing and tracing alone is really, really difficult. So we basically have two components that we need here. First of all, we need to have some degree of physical distancing remaining in the population in order for us to effectively keep the reproduction number below 1. But we also need to have really broad testing of symptomatic cases. And timeliness of contact tracing becomes important when we have widespread testing, but they really work in tandem. So you can't have really good timely finding of contacts if you don't have widespread testing and finding of those initial symptomatic cases. So that's all I wanted to say. I think, models are very important, especially in the early days of an emerging infectious disease, because there is so much uncertainty. And so we can use models to help us make decisions in the face of this uncertainty. And a really important thing to remember is that models are only as good as the data and assumptions that feed into them. And in our experience, we really need to work with frontline workers and decision makers to ground truth these models and revise them and make sure that we're asking the right questions and considering the right interventions. And, again, not to harp too much on the uncertainty, but I think this pandemic has really, really shown how quickly our understanding changes and how much shifting information there is. And we can really use models to monitor our response, to understand the most effective interventions, and ideally figure out how we can move from these more blunt force control measures to something that's more nuanced and tailored and not so restrictive to the population. And they allow us to see potential futures ahead of time. So as we're trying to figure out how to navigate a very uncertain future, we can test different interventions and try to get a sense of where they may lead. And that's all I wanted to say. Just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators listed on this slide. And thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. We do have questions here. So from our online question process, we have the first question. Can you speak to the possibility of a second wave? Any models for that? And for how long will measures have to be in place to prevent a second wave? So Danielle, Ashley, a question here from Danielle, and it says, can you speak to the possibility of a second wave? Any models for that? For how long will measures have to be in place to prevent a second wave?
It's a really great question. And I think the challenge in terms of the questions around second waves is that I think in Ontario, I would say we're still in our first wave. We're still dealing with it. And the question of a second wave is it's undoubtedly we are going to have more disease. We're going to have sort of resurgence as we relax measures. I think we can see that across the world in terms of how people are dealing with this. The question is, what is the timing going to look like and how do we deal with that? So there are places where, they have these initial resurgences of a disease. You sort of ramp up control measures and you bring things back under control. And then you have other jurisdictions where that first wave just, that plateaus a bit, and then it just seems like things are increasing and increasing. In terms of, as long as we have susceptibility in our population, we're going to be at risk of resurgences and increases in cases. In terms of how long are we going to need these measures in place, I think the answer is as long as we have a susceptible population. So until we reach that herd immunity threshold or until we have a vaccine. I think the reassuring thing is that as we understand more about the disease and how it's spread, I think we're going to rely less on these really blunt force measures, and we can, start to understand how we use combinations of interventions, such as masks and hand hygiene to control it.
And that's great. Actually, just one request: if you can just hit the stop sharing screen button. Then we can see
sorry.
you. Sorry. Another question here is from Jimmy. New data released yesterday showed serious flaws and errors in the U.S. modeling. Can you comment?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that errors in models are always a thing. I mean, the question, are we talking about errors or wrong assumptions or structural assumptions in terms of how a model is parameterized? I think, something that's been very interesting and important during this pandemic is that there has been so much dialogue and, sort of conversation around the different models, breaking them down, understanding what those underlying assumptions are. I think in general, the value of models is because we have so many of them is we can really compare them and, look at what are the general conclusions and the qualitative findings. And I think as much as you can, take issue with the assumptions that go into any single model, in general, they tend to lead us towards the same point and the same conclusions in terms of, what we need to do and what sort of interventions we need to implement. So it's tricky. I mean, it's no model is going to be perfect. All models are wrong. The question is, what can we gain from them and what inferences can we gather from them?
Great. And one last question here is, Ashley, we understand that the public health effort has been using your models published in CMAJ this past month to structure countermeasure strategies for COVID. Incidence estimates shifted partway through, causing many to claim that countermeasures were too severe at the outset. For example, mode of transmission became more clearly understood as droplet spread rather than airborne. Can you comment on some of the factors impacting on shifts in estimates?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I alluded to that in my talk. Is, you know, we're trying to model a new disease where we have imperfect information. So early on, a lot of these estimates were based on information for diseases that were like COVID-19. So based on SARS or based on influenza, based on early information that was coming out of China. And over time, that certainly has changed in terms of our understanding of how disease spread. I would say in the case of the modeling work that we've done, a lot of, you know, the sort of fundamentals haven't really changed. We've certainly refined some of those parameters, but I think, you know, fundamentally our understanding of, you know, how this is spread has remained unchanged. And I think some of the revisions in terms of the incidence estimates relate more to the fact that we intervened. And so capturing those intervention effects and, you know, how much testing and tracing we're doing and how contact patterns have changed are probably driving that more than sort of any sort of fundamental natural history parameters.
And you know, there was just one last question here, just wanted to sneak in here, which is from Ryan. With that graph about percentage of physical distancing and days to ICU full capacity, does that modeling take into account environmental factors like humidity, temperature, and seasons? And that'll be the last question we'll take.
Yeah, no, it's a very simple model where we're basically just taking away the physical distancing and not including information on seasonality.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing your knowledge base. We greatly appreciate it, and thanks for taking the time today.
No, thank you very much.
Great. So our next speaker is Mr. Bob Brewer. Relevant to today's event, Bob holds a master's degree in psychiatric epidemiology from Washington University and St. Louis Medical School. An educational pursuit began at the age of 49 and inspired by the 2003 and 4 SARS epidemic. After returning to Canada in 2010, Bob became founding president of the Midland Out of the Cold program, now the Guest House Emergency Shelter and Housing Hub. In 2011, Bob also began work at Aurelia's Soldiers Memorial Hospital as a mental health researcher and quality of care analyst. At the start of the year, Bob Bob's current research focus included post-discharge intentional self-harm, perinatal mental health, and the promotion of increased life expectancy and wellness by those encumbered by past or current serious mental illness and addiction. Over the past 14 weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, motivated particularly because two of Bob's favorite people in the whole world, grandchildren Adeline and Kai, lived within walking distance of soldiers, Bob has switched his attention to a 7 days a week vigil, doing all he can so SMH continues to provide their efforts of excellent compassion care every day. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Now I just have to share my screen, eh? And also get the show running from the beginning. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lisi. The title of my presentation today is "The Curve is Yellow," keeping it simple for my granddaughter, notwithstanding her comments. Disclosures, soldiers' mental health research efforts have at times been externally supported through pharmaceutical industry grants and speaker fees. This presentation will include a reference to a paper proposing the repurposing of psychotropic medications. I will provide a link to the paper, but I am not prepared to discuss repurposing medications within this forum. Off to the right there, you should be able to see, although I can't see, QR code, and it will appear throughout the presentation, and it will take you to pretty much a couple page, actually 3-page doc that has all the references, so you can quickly grab them. So if you have your phone handy at some point, just grab a view of that and it will take you there. A little bit of background for those who might not be familiar with our hospital. We're about an hour east of Collingwood, 148 bed community hospital, 130 kilometers north of Toronto, providing regional programs as well as medical and surgical services to Simcoe County and Muskoka region. We have peds, we have dialysis, we have some rehab beds, and we have about 50,000 emergency visits a year and about 1,000 mental health inpatient admissions per year. More than 900 babies are born there. And last but not least, I'll talk about this more, community mental health services. So my story, or our story, begins a long time ago, Monday, March the 23rd, when I got a subject line to an email from a superior that said epidemiology, and sort of tagged "you're it," the epidemiologist, for the next little while. Tiana Short, our manager of business intelligence and coding, needed some help with some modeling that the senior leaders wanted, and had requested my assistance. And that was wonderful because I love working with Tiana and I need her more than she needs me, to be honest. Anyways, we very quickly set some ground rules. And they were as follows, and this is international first off, because everybody in Canada from the get-go was a hero in our eyes, but externally, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, we figured rocked. Taiwan's COVID-19 response rocks. Everything else, we turned to our frontline staff. They were the experts on expected length of stay, and I think I heard Ashley refer to this too, that you got to go home to find out your best resource for some of these inputs in the modeling. Anyways, I can't take much credit for this, but within 3 days, this is the output that Tiana sent me. It was, I didn't say that it was built on a model out of Penn State, basic SIR model. And Tiana had managed to put together a worst case scenario and a best case scenario. And meanwhile, I was sort of given this long leash to be epidemiologist. And one thing I knew from the get-go was that some of our folks were highly anxious. I was receiving messages from doctors that could not sleep, various healthcare professionals that were very, very scared. And I wanted an online app, something they could look at their phone on and check the numbers out of our local public health district and track them over time. And I found such a model. You're looking at the computer view or the iPad view right now, but this does fit on an iPhone, and you can just touch any one of those dots there. This is just an image, so I can't do that. But if you touched on them on the real app, you would actually see the number you're searching for and the date and everything else. One thing I maybe should mention, that the green line there, the resolved cases, and you'll notice that I've moved forward in time. This is April the 5th. So about 10 days down from when we started with our first modeling, Tiana was worried that our staff should be able to see some measure of resolved cases graphically. And so we've got that on the green line right there. And the deaths down at the time were at 5, and the total cases are in red. Also, Tiana's team, they live and breathe Excel. So what I wanted to do was get the SIR model into Excel for them so that they could play around with it. And that's when I started to preach the title of this presentation. The curve is yellow, and the curve will fall. And we sure had to wait a long time for the curve to fall, but it did. Okay, so that's the yellow line right there. I know it's not precisely what's in the SIR model, but it was close enough. It was actually what I'm currently calling current open cases. And we had to wait till May the 10th for that line to start to fall. And at the time too, I was saying, we want to see this fall for 2 weeks. I don't want everybody, jumping up for joy just because one day it falls a little bit. And now you can see there's this consistent line, and people draw comfort from this because they waited on this and it happened. Also something that I thought everybody had to understand. It was perhaps important for me to say it. And I will apologize for the quality of this image, but Google had a very good map app online around the time we needed this in early April, where you could clearly see that Quebec to the east, without a protected border, had a very high prevalence, and to the west, with a border that, although you were supposed to go through customs, there were healthcare workers at the time traveling back and forth across the Detroit-Windsor border, providing healthcare, and that was just a frightening thing to me. And Lord knows they might have been doing the same thing at the Buffalo crossings too, but more close to what I wanted our folks to see was our numbers still remained low, that we were like an island in a storm, and that we had some pretty high numbers down in Toronto. Also, not high numbers, but illness. And so I wanted to get that on a graph again that they could, or a chart that they could see on their iPhone, something that they could see comparable. And because my background research most recently is in suicide, and that's measured in deaths per 100,000, we stuck with that metric. And so this is Toronto's death. This is actually just up to, I think, about last Saturday, this image here. So these are deaths per 100,000 in Toronto, the orange on the top, and I wanted them aware how higher Toronto was in comparison to us. There is us on the bottom, just a huge difference. And then in the center there, the gray line is actually the rest of Ontario teased out, and then the green line is just in case somebody wants to test our data against the Public Health Ontario. You know, I can screw up sometimes, but you know, anyway. One other thing was, you know, a better metric would be deaths per 100,000. Some people might be familiar with this National Geographic article that came out at the beginning of April, looking at Philadelphia on the left, and they knew they had the illness, the 1918-19 virus from flu in their community, and yet they held off to have a parade. And that's the consequences of that. Whereas St. Louis, where I studied, former hometown, they saw the illness, they acted quicker, they saw a second wave, they acted on that one too, and they saw half the deaths per 100,000. Just to put this in context, that death rate in Philadelphia would be about 4 times the rate of cardiovascular deaths. So just huge. So all to say that I wanted us looking at deaths per 100,000 too. So we had an app up and available to anybody to check deaths per 100,000. And drawing here on Ontario Public Health, their data down in Toronto. As we moved along, people became more concerned. Ashley was just talking in reference to testing and tracing. And so we started to think about it. And actually, I'm citing a slightly different paper from what Ashley's looking at. There's a wonderful article at the Harvard Global Health Institute on why we are possibly looking at 22 to 24,000 tests per day and keeping the positivity less than 5%. I was trained in epidemiology research. I wasn't trained on boots on the ground stuff. So I went out and got my contact tracing certificate from Johns Hopkins. It's online. Recommend it to anybody that's curious about this. And about the time I completed that, we were looking for a measure of this that we could offer folks on their phones. And son of a gun, if the daily epidemiological summary all of a sudden put together this figure number 3 every day. And so I got a short URL that I connected everybody with. And so they can now, with the URL, they can just click on this figure instantly to see what the current number of tests being done and the positivity rate is. It's not perfect. It's not what I would want, but we couldn't get our hands on what I wanted for data. So, but we also wanted to have a little bit of fun. Competition is good. And Alberta, which is the orange line on the top there, has been doing outstanding as far as testing from the get-go. And there's us in green. And you can see way back April 15th, we were, I better not in this forum say what I was going to say. And we weren't doing so well, but right now we are possibly catching up to Alberta. And finally, the ICES folks wonderfully came out at the end of April with, they merged together all the testing results and some of the hospital data and a whole lot of demographics, and pulled it all together for us. And this is one takeaway that I saw that just grabbed me right away, that almost 2/3 of the tests being done in the province are by women, and that they are getting 58% of the positive cases. And thinking from a structural equation model perspective, that sort of leaves me thinking that there's a whole lot of men walking around the province that have been positive and not gone to get tested. And it got me thinking we need another way to measure this illness besides just tests and cases and everything else. And so I wanted to go at our hospitalization data and get a handle on that. Similar chart here. Tiana contacted our folks down at Queen's Park and sort of said, hey, we're giving you the data. We want to act now. And so we got access and we were able to make an app for that. You'll see that it does bounce all over the place. And so questionable whether it has any value, but towards the time that we got into vacation season here, you see how we're creeping above the Ontario average. So that caused us a little bit of concern that we had moved about the Ontario average. We never got anything that was near as nice as St. Cuomo. He could get on there every day and go, you know, the curve is falling, the curve is falling, but it is what it is. And our team was gaining, and they knew more what they wanted. And about, I guess a month ago, they knew that they wanted Kuchiching numbers and they wanted recent Kuchiching numbers. So we said 14 days, we'll highlight in red. Kuchiching is the area immediately around our hospital. Muskoka is important to me and our folks on the mental health team because we are responsible for all Muskoka inpatient healthcare. Mental health care. Barrie is less than a half an hour to the south of us, so that's sort of important. They also wanted me to start prognosticating or whatever, predicting, and lo and behold, I nailed it the first week and haven't nailed it ever since, to tell you the truth, but we keep trying. But one of the reasons I might be missing, here's my excuse, I would love to have the gasoline sales data for Simcoe County. This is from the States, and look at how it dropped there as the epidemic emerged and people social distance. It's just, wow. I'd use that as a proxy in a heartbeat. This is a picture of the dashboard that Tiana has put together for our senior leaders. They had quite a bit of input that they wanted this chart on the left with Kuchiching and everything else. But you'll notice it says predictive model, but there's not an awful lot of modeling there anymore. So anyways, that's what they're happy with on a weekly basis now. So we're happy. Nobody seems happy to view my Excel files that look at countries around the world and looks at change over the week. And also I've got it for US states and provinces. But if there's any geeks out there that would like copies of that, I'll be happy to share it. It's actually, there is a link to it on the references for this presentation. A year ago at this time, I was presenting at the Waypoint conference, talking about how we had to do something about data sharing and everything, because we had this huge risk factor associated with folks showing up in the emergency department. The biggest predictor was past year discharge from mental health. And so the pipeline is, I think I've been justified, as I heard the term mentioned by Ashley about the pipeline being slow. Well, it sure is slow. But I'm going to move into mental health really quickly to say that some of the folks have, these are former classmates here that have put together sort of alternative ways that psychiatrists can be engaged, psychiatric researchers can be engaged. It's a recent paper that just came out from a friend, Mark Senior in Toronto, looking at Google searches before and after the outbreak of COVID. And you can see, actually, it's good to read the discussion because Mark goes into some good detail explaining why all of this should be expected, really. It's a picture of our head of psychiatry, Dr. Anjana Chawla. I'm just sort of merging my way into mental health here, not in a real organized fashion. She's there not because of research we published on our approach to mental health care, but because she's wearing walking shoes, because our docs walk. Happy to report that there are a lot of losses for our clients and patients. But one thing for sure, I understand that Dr. Guller puts on his spacesuit and still walks with their patients. One of the huge losses regionally, including Collingwood, is the fact that they weren't able to hold the World Maternity Mental Health Walk this year. Although my colleague Jamie on the left there was able to come up with a pretty good Facebook alternative. She has left me these comments. The clear comment is that COVID cases of perinatal mood disorder are much higher due to isolation, fear of birth, etc. And she ascribes it to lack of support. If lack of support definitely goes hand in hand with Mandy Hilliard, who's in charge of our metabolic clinic. This is her receiving the Nightingale Award in 2019. Of course, she can't meet and exercise with her clients anymore, which really, really hurts. But she put together this little newsletter here, which I have included a sample of in the references. And she delivers it on Fridays. And our dialectic behavior program, which we know is strongly associated with reduced risk of future readmission once people start the program. And that's down, but they've got a Zoom platform ready to bring it back up again. Also, they wanted me to mention the meeting place, which is a local clubhouse in Aurelia that the members are struggling and scared about the future of their program. Also, bringing it closer to the close, great hero of mine, our addiction counselor, Jim Walker. I have not commented on the fact that overdoses are record numbers in BC, also in Alberta and Ontario. Also, liquor sales are up with LCBO. So we might have a problem downstream with addictions. And Jim has reported that some of his clients have failed. I hope you can have a look at this slide and look at it in detail. The concurrent groups that he's run are outstanding. Jim also said in an email to me that folks are really missing the Georgian Wood program at Waypoint. I know that it had to shut down in order to be ready for the COVID pandemic. Anyways, that's all I've got. Thanks to Tiana, Paul, Jennifer, and the OSMH mental health team for the updates. My team is Dr. Jamie Karaganis, who the polite way would be to refer to him as my chief skeptic over the pandemic. Dr. Matthew Large in Australia, Ron and Rod Phillips in Taiwan, our local public health heroes, Michelle Hunter, who does all things Twitter for me, even when I yell at her, and my dad, who's covering boots on the ground in long-term care in Mississauga, and my grandchildren covering Aurelia in general. And a question from a very high school student. Yes, I'm looking forward to returning to mental health, especially after talking to my former co-team members yesterday. Just so inspired by them. Anyways, that's me.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. Just time for one question here. And so Bob, your role as a psychiatric epidemiologist is a fascinating one during this pandemic, as alarming rates of psychosis and unmanaged mental illness and substance abuse have been reported. Similar to the Mike Harris days, patients end up somewhere like the ER, prison or worse. Moving forward into phase 2 with services reopening, is virtual care enough?
Sorry, I could not hear my audio.
Great. Just can you hear me well now, Bob?
I can now. Yeah, sorry about that.
So I'll repeat that question. So Bob, your role as a psychiatric epidemiologist is a fascinating one. And during this pandemic especially, as alarming rates of psychosis and unmanaged mental illness and substance abuse have been reported. Similar to the Mike Harris days, patients end up somewhere like the ER, prison or worse. Moving forward into phase 2 with services reopening, is virtual care enough?
It's virtual care. You got cut off right at the end.
Is virtual care enough?
Oh, it's a wonderful option. For example, I mentioned my research partner, Matthew Large in Australia. And Matthew said early on, because he was in charge of a COVID mental health ward there, and he said, he said, my patients really prefer me on TV instead of with this mask and everything else on. And I know that I don't know who said, it might have been Dr. Karaganis. Somebody had said to me, we really led, psychiatry really led with telemedicine. So we are real leaders in this area. And so I think it's a definite option. And particularly, you mentioned psychosis. I know that it hasn't all been bad for some people with psychosis. A lot of them are being able to manage our environment an awful lot more during social distancing. So there are some plus sides to it. I know that Dr. Guller had mentioned that it's almost like they feel that they're not being blamed for everything for once in their life. And so they're finding it's a little bit easier to move through society. So I really, really look forward Ontario has some wonderful data collection records in something called the RAI. And so I'm really, really looking forward to looking at this issue post-pandemic. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Great honor. I love this program, by the way.
Thanks, Bob. Great. So we're going to pivot now and we're going to move into our next speaker. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Martin. And Dr. Martin received his Bachelor of Life Sciences at Queen's University. He completed his undergraduate medical education, emergency medicine residency, and critical care fellowship at the University of Western Ontario in London. Dr. Martin has held many leadership roles, including the Emergency Medicine Resident Coordinator, Advanced Cardiac Life Support Lead Instructor, Advanced Trauma Life Support Instructor, and Director of Medical Education. He is the Chief and Medical Director of Intensive Care at the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre in Barrie, Ontario. Dr. Martin also works as a transport medicine physician for Orange Air Ambulance. Let's welcome him today.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm just make sure we can hear me okay. I'm going to be doing a talk on the effects of COVID in the intensive care unit. As mentioned, I'm an intensivist here in Barrie. And since these predictive models that were discussed came out, we obviously furiously planned for what was going to be an overwhelming burden on the critical care system. So to start off, first of all, the only conflict of interest, I was early on asked to be a consultant for Synaptive Medical, who was asked by the government to mass produce ventilators for the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was a non-paid role, but it won't affect anything I have in my talk today. So we don't have much time. I mean, critical care for COVID is a massive topic. So I want to focus on a couple things. There's other epidemiology stuff, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the globally, locally, but I do want to speak quickly about the critical care burden. We're going to talk about supporting acute respiratory failure because at the end of the day, that is the major problem with COVID is the pneumonia and acute lung injury that it brings with it. And we're going to briefly talk about adjunctive treatments. So here we go. So everyone's seen this Johns Hopkins kind of data that was, this tally, the number of cases worldwide. And we would sit in the orange control room watching this. It was just, unbelievably horrifyingly scary at times. In Canada, of course, we've had the burden, as mentioned. Quebec and Ontario have been hit the hardest. And so the questions are always, how many of those patients are going to require critical care? So every day for the last several months, we've had this census sent to us by the Critical Care Services Ontario, which in our province is the kind of secretariat, if you will, of critical care. And they also have a data analytic department. And so they've been sending all the numbers from each region or LINs in our province of the number of critical care patients. And if you look at this graph, what we're seeing here is the number of COVID positive patients in each unit. So as of June 13th, the number of critical care patients in the system in Ontario was 1,473. And of those, 103 were positive, COVID positive patients. Now, if you look at the graph, the red line represents those COVID positive cases. And you can see early on in March and April, that ramp started to go up and it peaked with a census or an incidence of about 280 patients at its peak. The problem was early on with those models, as we discussed, is that we didn't know where that curve was going to stop or where that rise was going to end. There were some models that said that rise was going to end in the thousands, and hence the immense preparation. Luckily, with all the different social distancing, you can see a steady decline since the kind of first third of April in our critical care COVID patients within the province, which is a good thing. The gray line represents patients under investigation. So we're still testing just as many people for COVID, but luckily just less positives in the critical care unit. This is just second graph, just shows our region, which we're in the central in Collingwood, Barrie, all the way down to the north of Toronto. And we actually had the highest number of COVID patients. And it was really around Markham, Stouffville, up and towards Newmarket. And we were very blessed in Simcoe, Muskoka, because it really stopped at Newmarket in terms of the critical care burden. We had prepared for 100 critical care patients. And you can see behind me is our boards where we were going to put all the different patients that we were going to place everywhere in the hospital with their critical illness. And luckily in Simcoe Muskoka, and this data is a couple days old, but we had 511 cases. And in RVH itself, in our hospital, we only had 20 inpatients who were positive. And unfortunately, of those, 7 died. Within our ICU, we've had 7 COVID patients, and unfortunately, 3 deaths. And 6 of those required invasive ventilation. So we were very lucky. And I think in the rest of the region, I believe Aurelia had one other vented COVID patient, and other, obviously the Collingwood and Midland and other hospitals surrounding the region had COVID patients, but very few critically ill ones. So we were spared for this wave. So how do we compare to, the rest of the world with this? Well, in terms of critical care patients, if we look at Wuhan, China, the proportion of hospitalized patients requiring ICU is about a quarter, and that was seen the same in New York, a little less in Italy. It's sometimes hard to compare ICU data across the world because it's very different definitions of what an ICU is and where patients are managed. And in the Ontario data, of course, is a little bit higher. The average age of the critical care patients is going to be in their 60s, mostly male. And again, hypertension being the biggest comorbidity of those patients that require critical care for COVID. The invasive ventilation is variable. I mean, in China, they use a lot of high flow nasal cannula, which are essentially humidified, very fast moving oxygen in the nose that can support heavy breathing when people are in distress. BiPAP masks or non-invasive ventilation, which is like a fighter pilot mask, which blows pressure. And then of course, invasive ventilation is having an endotracheal tube in your throat and being on a ventilator or life support. And those numbers vary, but our numbers support more what was in Italy and New York, which is kind of a 70 to 80% rate of needing invasive ventilation. And I'll speak to that in a second. The rate of kidney failure requiring dialysis in China, only 5%, and we're seeing 20% here in Ontario. So the challenge of the ventilatory support was this, that we've had so much conflicting information and data, and things have changed. Initially, we were said, right away, get them intubated. Don't use high flow nasal cannula. Don't use BiPAP. Just as soon as they hit 6 liters per minute of oxygen, we need to put them on the ventilator. In May, of course, then all of a sudden they said, okay, well, actually, maybe let's try that because we're going to run out of ventilators. Then physiology data came out of Italy showing different lung phenotypes. And then this thing emerged called, is COVID really giving us what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is ARDS, which people maybe heard of, or is it pseudo-ARDS? And I'll speak to that in a second. The biggest stress for critical care and for most hospitals was PPE. And we worried about how these different methods of delivering oxygen to these patients would affect healthcare risk. So we said, well, we can't put people on high flow oxygen or BiPAP because it's going to disperse the virus, and we don't have enough N95 masks to protect everyone. So that's why some places said just intubate them. It'll be safer for the staff. But we had no data on this. And if you look at most of the data was taken from SARS and said, because a lot of unfortunately healthcare workers got sick during the SARS epidemic in 2003. And we took some of that data. We also have studies like this one, which is actually a smoke data study. So essentially, patients would inhale a non-toxic smoke, and they would measure how far the smoke would travel given the different things, means of oxygenating people. So if you put someone on those very high flow nasal cannula, which are great ways of giving people oxygen, you only got about 17 centimeters of smoke dispersion. If you put someone on a CPAP mask, like people that have obstructive sleep apnea, but we use it with a lot higher pressures, that number goes up to 33, so a little farther. But even a simple face mask was 40. So the data really didn't jive with what was being recommended by the province, but the province had to weigh on the side of safety for staff. So that's why all these things were considered AGMPs, or aerosol generating medical procedures. So things that put staff at risk. You need to wear N95 masks, try to be in a negative pressure room. The problem was we didn't have a lot of those. So it was very confusing as to how to best oxygenate these patients, because at the end of the day, these COVID patients can't oxygenate. They can't get oxygen into their blood. So if we kind of look at the patient, so here's a patient that we had in our ICU. This is a 65-year-old male with COVID. And the x-ray you see on the left is his x-ray when he came in to emerge, complaining of some shortness of breath. It was early on. And his x-ray is pretty normal. He returned 3 days later with the x-ray on the right and was requiring some oxygen. I was asked to see him, and within literally 12 hours, he had decompensated and needed intubation. And you can see in his CT scan what COVID-19 looks like to the lungs. So the x-rays looks kind of impressive, but the CT scan is very impressive. You can see these patchy white, we call it ground glass inflammation in the lungs. And this is the major pathogenesis of COVID-19. It causes acute lung injury and the ability to oxygenate. If you look at the picture of C, D, and F, you'll see that on a CT scan, when they're lying flat, there's more of the white at the back of the lungs. And in D, you're looking at a side cut. So slice me down the middle and look from the side. So the disease is predominantly in the back of the lung. And that because people lie flat, gravity pulls the blood that way. There's more disease that way. This is why sometimes we flip people and we talk about proning them or basically getting them to lie in their stomach, both by themselves or once we have them on the ventilator. And that ideally what we want to do is perfuse the good parts of the lung, which are the front of the lungs, the anterior parts. And so you hear things about proning. And that's honestly one of the only things we had in our arsenal once they're on the ventilator to help them. So how do we escalate our oxygen therapy? Well, our old recommendations from the Society of Critical Care Medicine, we maybe can go with high flow nasal cannula, maybe better, but all the recommendations were weak recommendations with low quality evidence. And what we were doing is we were taking evidence from other diseases and extrapolating it to COVID-19, which may work, may not. The high flow nasal cannula, which has become a good weapon in the fight against COVID, really had no evidence that increased transmission of disease. They really were pushing that as an alternative. And high flow over the BiPAP mask was always preferred. Again, based on a study that wasn't about COVID, but was with this acute lung injury from other causes. We'll talk about CPAP very briefly. So CPAP, everyone knows, some people have obstructive sleep apnea and they have that nasal or face mask so they don't snore at night and they sleep better. And we use that at a little higher levels in COVID based on what's called increasing your mean airway pressure. So if you sleep with one at night or someone you love sleeps with CPAP, they usually have 5 centimeters of water of pressure. But in COVID and in respiratory failure, we actually give you 18 to 20 centimeters of airway pressure. And this diagram I've taken courtesy of the Palm Crit website shows how it just increases your mean airway pressure, which essentially, if you think about it, inflates the lung. So you're breathing, instead of breathing like this, really small, you're breathing big volumes, recruits alveoli, better oxygenation. And so that's the theory behind the CPAP. The nice thing is it doesn't put you on a ventilator. Patients can be awake for it and can often roll on their stomach and, again, prone themselves, breathe on their stomach while they're on this mask. And this is used a lot in Italy with these kind of special helmet CPAP machines, which essentially looks like a kind of an old school scuba helmet. And were very effective. But again, not a lot of evidence, a lot of physiology and a lot of disagreement about the physiology. So how do we do it here in Barrie and in most places in the province and probably North America is that up to 6 liters, if you need oxygen for your hypoxia, we'll put you on a conventional nasal prongs or an oxy mask. Once you get past that, we want to put you on the high flow nasal cannula. And the big reason is that not only does it give you oxygen, it gives you flow. If you take a deep breath right now, you're breathing in up to potentially 2 liters of air. And if you do that, 20 or 30 times a minute, your flow rates are 60, 70, 80 liters a minute. And if I'm only giving you oxygen at 5, 6 liters per minute, you're bringing in a lot of room air. So you're diluting out your oxygen. So the high flow nasal cannula relaxes the work of breathing. And we think that actually damages lung in COVID. It's called PSILI, which is a kind of weird acronym, but it stands for patient self-induced lung injury. So by giving those flows, we can decrease that. Now, if that doesn't work, we'll try positive pressure CPAP, preferably in a negative pressure room. And again, all staff are wearing N95s. And if that fails, we'll have to put on the ventilator. And at both these times, we can see we'll either ask the patient to roll themselves in their stomach, or once they're on the life support, we'll flip them over and ventilate them most of the time on their stomach to see if we can improve their oxygen levels. The strategies for ventilation, I'm not going to get into detail, but we really don't know. And so we've taken what we know from acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, and this is literature just going back to the Vietnam War, and we're applying it to COVID. Low tidal volume, so you don't stretch your lungs too much. Don't give you too much pressure on the ventilator so we don't blow too much air in. And we want to give what's called high PEEP, so high positive and expiratory pressure. So again, we want to keep those lungs inflated. We don't want to give you too much fluid. I always tell the residents soggy lungs are unhappy lungs. And we will try to ventilate you in your stomach. And in worst case scenarios, we ship you down to Toronto General to put you on cardiopulmonary bypass or ECMO. So I'm not going to give the ARDSNet PEEP table too much, but essentially the recommendation was the higher PEEP table. And if we see some of the data in Italy, across the world, they were most of the time following this kind of algorithm. If we look at the bottom right corner, the average pressure and expiratory pressure was about 14 to 16, which would fit with the ARDSNet protocols. But you can see a wide range of oxygen. These patients die of hypoxia or lack of oxygen. And that's the biggest concern. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about how to ventilate these people. And we have no real good evidence right now. We have a lot of observational studies. We have a lot of, again, using studies from other diseases and extrapolating them. And so now we get into which critical care physicians love. We love talking about physiology. And so the LNH phenotypes is a description from a very brilliant Italian critical care physician, Gattinoni, who's done tons of research in ARDS. And his observation, he works in Germany, of how these lungs work is that there's two kinds of lungs. There's kind of like a baby lung. It's very easy to expand, lots of air. And the reason why you can't get oxygen as a patient's oxygen level is low is because there's problems with regulation of the blood supply to those lungs. And so we don't want to necessarily use ARDSNet for that. But over time, you get more water, more inflammation, and then they become stiff lungs. And these are the classic ARDS lungs that we know, we've studied. And so this came out and, okay, well, we better just change how we ventilate them. And that's kind of a dangerous because this is a theory. The only data that we have since that, this is out of Brigham Young and Beth Israel in Boston. And there, they weren't allowed to use BiPAP or high flow oxygen. They had to intubate patients once they hit 6 liters per minute. That was their rule at the hospital, which is a little aggressive, but that's what they did. But they got some great early data. And they showed that actually, at the bottom right, you'll see the C stat. That stands for compliance. So how easy the lungs are to expand. And I'll tell you that number of 40, that's pretty stiff. So it wasn't really doing that L phenotype that Gattinoni described. So what we can take from this study is that, to be honest, we really don't know yet what's going on. We're getting little pieces here and there. And as this disease moves forward, we'll understand it more. But there really are no definitive physiology yet on it. And it doesn't seem to be true ARDS. And maybe it's pseudo-ARDS. And what I mean by that is ARDS has very specific but kind of wide-ranging criteria of what gives you ARDS. You have to be really hypoxic, so low oxygen. You have to have bilateral or infiltrating your chest x-ray. It can't be heart failure. And what happens with a lot of these COVID patients is on the bottom left, you'll see that when we optimize your lung function, your oxygenation gets better. And that's really not ARDS. ARDS, you optimize their lung function and they still are sick and you can't get their oxygen level up. And those are the patients that all these studies on ARDS were dealing with. A lot of the COVID patients, when you give them a little bit of positive pressure, all of a sudden their oxygenation does a lot better. And so we probably are not dealing with the same disease. So what do? Well, we try to use our logic, use our physiology, but physiology unfortunately doesn't play out sometimes. So what else can we do? Well, I'm not going to go through all these because they're in detail, but I'll tell you one thing. There's no good evidence for any of them. Anticoagulation, we know they clot easily. IVIG, give them basically immune cells that'll fight infection. Transfuse them blood from people who have recovered from COVID and who have antibodies. All the antivirals and drugs you read about in the media, like Kaletra, hydroxychloroquine, Trump's favorite drug, remdesivir, which has got a little bit of evidence for maybe decreased symptomatology, and steroids, which just came out yesterday. There was this big news event. Oh, this dexamethasone in England, everyone should have it. And I will tell you right now that none of it yet has definitive, conclusive evidence in critical care patients that it helps. And so we always have to be very cautious in an attempt to find something to treat people that we remember the kind of a first thing in medical school we get learned is prima non nocere, which means first do no harm, because all of these have side effects. So if I put someone on heparin because I think they're procoagulant, they could bleed. If I give them hydroxychloroquine, they could have prolonged QT or visual issues. And steroids, hyperglycemia, although fairly well tolerated. The steroids maybe has the most kind of potential right now, I think. There was a recent trial in March that came out, and it wasn't about COVID, it was about ARDS. But the problem was no one was reading anything but COVID. So it kind of got missed, but it's actually showed a good benefit from dexamethasone early. We've used steroids, we've dappered in steroids for a long time with ARDS. And they've been, it's weak recommendation you should try steroids early in the course of ARDS. So more details to come because they have not published that data of England yet. It was a news release, which I'm always cautious about whenever you hear it on CNN before you actually see the paper. So here's I think the biggest concern that I have with what to do with these patients is that since May, there's been 23,000 publications on COVID-19, and that number is going to double every 20 days apparently. But despite this, we have lots of observational studies, lots of physiology, but very few randomized controlled trials. And until we see those, we're kind of left with taking good trials from other diseases or using not as good trials from COVID and deciding what to do. So our management is going to change in the next 6 months to a year. It really feels like this. You don't know what to read. So in summary, I know it's not much time to go through critical care, but you're looking at about a 20 to 40% ICU rate, 20% rate of needing dialysis. And I think that you can use high flow safely, but we have to protect our staff. And until we have better evidence, we have to manage the respiratory failure like we manage ARDS, understanding that it's probably not the same disease, but that if we go down the path of just jumping on the first train that shows something new, we've done that before, we've gotten burned. So far, no adjacent treatments or adjuvant treatments, that's supposed to say, has shown benefit in critical care COVID patients. But hopefully something will, because a 30% mortality is high, and there's been a lot of young people have died from this, and there will be more. So thank you for your time, thank you for your invitation, and welcome questions at this time.
Great, thank you, Dr. Martin. Great talk. There are some questions here. So first one is, thank you, Dr. Martin, for your talk. This is a fascinating subject and shift from the ARDS strategies. When you put people on the vent, has high flow oxygen been effective, or is there a preferred vent strategy?
So is the high flow preferred or putting them on the ventilators? That's the question, Mike? So you cut it a little bit.
The question here is, when you put people on the ventilator, has high flow oxygen been effective, or is there a preferred vent strategy?
Got it. So when we speak about the high flow is actually not theoretically on the ventilator. It's a nasal prongs with humidified high flow. So you're actually not on the ventilator. You're still awake, breathing. You actually can eat with this stuff. And so it's effective, and we'll try that for a while because the ventilator at the end of the day causes lung damage. But if you get tired on that, or you need more pressure, then we'll put you on the ventilator. And we will at this point start off with the ARDSNet recommended ventilation strategy, low tidal volumes, higher PEEP, and we'll do some physiological studies. We'll do paralysis, and we'll do something called decremental PEEP trials to see where the optimum level of support is, because every patient's different. But we'll start with that ARDSNet protocol.
Great, that's great. And Chris, just so I can ask you to take off your screen sharing as well, so we can see you too when you're answering.
Got it.
But another question here while you're doing that.
There we go.
Perfect, thank you. So can you speak to consequences of COVID post-recovery? For example, this individual asks, I have heard reports of long-term oxygen requirements, lung transplants, heart attacks, strokes. Can you speak to some of these types of long-term effects post-recovery?
Sure. So, I mean, at this point, we don't know, because the longest term recovery is going to be stuff from that we're getting from China from January. But my assumption is going to be we're going to have the same problem with the COVID patients leaving the ICU that we have with some of the ARDS survivors, that they do have long-term oxygen requirements. Some of that lung gets damaged and doesn't come back, so you lose your capacity. Anytime you're in the ICU, of course, we have post-ICU syndrome, which can involve, unfortunately, psycho and social issues, PTSD from being in the intensive care unit, chronic weakness. And so there's lots of issues once you leave the ICU, especially with the length of stay for these patients is sometimes 18 to 21 days on the ventilator. We've currently got our last patient. He just came off the ventilator after 3 weeks, and he is exceptionally weak right now, and that's going to be a long-term issue. So there's definitely going to be both lung issues, weakness issues, and unfortunately also some potential mental issues as well.
Great. Another question. Use of 6 milligram dexamethasone. Thoughts on that?
So the trial of the dexamethasone looking back at the ARDS was actually 20 milligrams for the first 5 days and then 10 milligrams for another 5 days. The study out of England that just I saw in the news yesterday, I haven't seen the data, so I'm not sure the protocols. But definitely, I think that if we're looking at an anti-inflammatory dose for dexamethasone, it's probably going to be a bit bigger than 6 milligrams. And it makes sense it would kind of work. We know that steroids work in severe community-acquired pneumonia. We've got good evidence for that. We've got some evidence that it works for septic shock, and both of those diseases cause ARDS. So it would make sense that there is some benefit to it, but in a little bigger dose.
And just additional follow-up question to that first one. What are your thoughts on high-frequency oscillation and for ventilation strategies?
Good. So HFO, or high frequency ventilation, is very cool ventilation. Essentially, it's like a drum that vibrates and oxygenates that way. Unfortunately, we looked at it for ARDS. We used to use it as a rescue therapy when you couldn't use anything else. And a study was done in Canada, actually, was one of the major studies that unfortunately showed that it actually probably caused more mortality in ARDS and was stopped early. So I don't know of any evidence for it in COVID. Definitely if it's a different disease process than ARDS, someone may look at it again, but I'm not aware of any evidence for it. So at this time, we wouldn't use it. We would probably go to proning and then as a rescue, ECMO. There's also some evidence for pulmonary vasodilators. Again, they don't change outcome, but may increase your oxygenation. And that's stuff like nitric oxide or prostaglandins.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. Thanks, Chris. Greatly appreciate your time and your expertise. Greatly valued. And thanks again.
Thanks very much for having me. Take care.
Great. So we're changing up the itinerary a bit here to accommodate some of our international colleagues, and we're going to go across the pond over to Italy here now, and want to introduce you to Dr. Richard Naspro. And Dr. Richard Naspro is a fully certified laparoscopic robotic urological surgeon at Papa Giovanni 23rd Hospital in Bergamo, Italy, where he also leads the bladder and adrenal unit and coordinates the outpatient care and the outpatient clinic there. After graduating from the Faculty of Medicine, University of Milan, Italy in 2001, he undertook specialist training in urology at San Raffaele Vita Salute University in 2006 and completed a fellowship in laparoscopic and robotic surgery at the Clinique Saint-Augustin in Bordeaux, France. His postgraduate training included a university diploma in laparoscopic surgery of gastrointestinal tract at the Université Louis Pasteur in Strasbourg, France. And in 2003, that was in 2003, and the Surgical Leadership Program class of 2019 at Harvard Medical School in the United States in Boston. Dr. Naspro established a urological surgical program at Tulum Hospital in the extreme north region of Cameroon in 2013, currently lectures medical students of the University of Milano Bicocca. I probably butchered that one, Milano Bicocca, so you can probably correct me there, Richard, on the pronunciation. And that's the School of Medicine and Surgery, and is a tutor and proctor for laparoscopic surgery. He is a member of the editorial board of the Canadian Journal of Urology and is a reviewer for many indexed international medical journals. Dr. Naspro's main areas of expertise are management and investigation of bladder and kidney cancer, urological oncology. He is regional coordinator of the Italian Society of Uro-Oncology, management of high-risk cardiovascular urological patients, quality and surgical research, and he is an author of 69 peer-reviewed publications. Richard, was quite pleased to have you across the pond there giving us a talk, and want to and look forward to hearing you speak. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the presentation. and it was a good pronunciation, actually. It's not obviously easy. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to share our experience. Many would be wondering why a urologist would be involved in COVID, but as you will see, I will try to go through our experience, where every single specialist in my hospital, but also in the north of Italy, had to relocate and change his everyday surgical or non-surgical activity, focusing completely on COVID. Basically, we had to change for 2 months from normality to dealing with non-ICU, of course, patients, but obviously very compromised patients. I heard a very nice presentation before, and you saw that many patients were on invasive ventilation, but most of them were on non-invasive ventilation. So it was a challenge, it was a task for us surgeons, of course, and the whole system was changed. And I will show you what happened to our hospital. As a reminder, we must know that Italy was the first country after China, or at least in Europe, to be hit by the surge, the wave of COVID. Everybody knows now what we're talking about. But you can imagine on the 1st of March, when we started seeing cases, this was new. We did not know anything. Everything was empirical, and we did not know what was going on. As you can see in Italy, on the 21st of March, we had 6,557 cases in one day, and this went on steadily up to the end of April. So something very new. We didn't have any other evidence. The only evidence was from China, and obviously news was not very well distributed. We didn't have anybody to talk to, basically. And as you can see, up to now, after the lockdown, after 2 months of lockdown, we can say that in June, we have had in Italy 237,000 positive, more people healed than deaths, but as you can see, 34,000 people died due to this disease. And as you can see from this graphic, as expected after lockdown, you can see that the active number of patients is decreasing, the recoveries are increasing, and the deaths happened typically in the middle of the surge. But just to show you where Italy is, not only geographically, but also as far as COVID is concerned, you can see that the northern part of Italy, near Switzerland, near France, near Austria, had the biggest impact, 81,000 cases. And whilst in the south of Italy and in the islands, this was not actually perceived, probably due to an early, very early lockdown. But you can see we had 2 different kinds of diseases in the country. And Lombardy, as I said, is in the north of Italy, a relatively small area, but with 10 million inhabitants. And my location in Bergamo, where I live and work, we have more than 1 million inhabitants, a third of the Milan metropolitan area, which is only half an hour away. So a small and very densely inhabited area. And these were all ingredients that made the virus so fastly spread at the beginning of the contact, the initial contact. And in Lombardy, my area, Bergamo in the red here, was the most hit area, the most densely inhabited.
And Richard, I'm just going to jump in. Are you able to share your slides for the folks as well? Can you share your screen in any way? I think we're just you're seeing your face and not the slides themselves. Is there a way to?
Again.
Perfect.
Can you see this now?
Yeah, yes, we can. Thank you.
Is this better? Can you see now?
Yes, I can. Yes, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry about this. I apologize. So I won't go back from the beginning, obviously, because you heard me somehow, right? Correct?
We heard the words. I just didn't see the screen
okay.
you were referring to. That's all.
Okay, so this was the slide where I was showing about the cases. Okay, 6,000 cases at the beginning of March. This is the graphic where I showed you where the healing and the deaths of the patients was quite sort of typical in a lockdown condition. And this is geographically where Italy is. And as you can see, the northern Italy, the Italian part, was the most effective area. It's quite sort of scary when you look at it this way, obviously. And this is just to show you within the region where Bergamo is. Bergamo is tucked in between the mountains, a very densely inhabited place with a lot of industries and a lot of people. So pollution, a lot of people, obviously helped contagion. And compared to the other provinces of my region, Bergamo was the most hit. So this is where I was. And on a sad point, you can see that mortality had its peak at the end of March, and where Bergamo registered plus 567% of deaths compared to the year before. This is quite scary, obviously, and made us think, and it was a tragedy, basically, as you can imagine. Since then, obviously, different areas in the world have experienced the same tragedy, but unfortunately, this is not a claim to fame. We were the first hospital to be hit. As Papa Giovanni Hospital, you can see, is a very big 1,000 bed hospital. It's a county hospital, and it was the first center involved in the crisis. Just during the crisis, some colleagues and myself wrote a letter to the New England Journal where we sort of found and started thinking about what was going on, and we were trying to give an explanation. And one of the problems of the crisis was that our hospital was probably becoming the major COVID carrier, as people were coming in from everywhere and we were completely infected. And we realized and started realizing that a patient-centered care was not adequate in a surge, in a pandemic. And it had to be replaced by community-centered care where people were staying home and the care was going to them rather than coming to hospital. And we realized, this was mid-March, that this thing could have happened anywhere. In any wealthy or unwealthy, obviously, country, the same thing could happen. Consider we're in March, where most people were not locked down yet. A lot of countries, especially in Europe, were neglecting the problem politically, but also socially. And this was quite sort of scary for us, that we were living something so soon. And we arrived saying that coronavirus was the Ebola of the rich, and it required a coordinated approach, which wasn't happening then in mid-March, in a completely new environment as it was. So as time passed, we sort of reacted. We had to react, and obviously as a urologist, I will give you my point of view, but I think it can be applicable to many specialties or subspecialties. Basically, we realized that we were by ourselves at the beginning. So choices had to be made. We didn't have anybody who we could talk to, and mistakes were made. And this is just a photograph of what was going on. And I'm sure that since then, many of us, or many of you, have found themselves in the same position. Basically, what we did find out was that we had to redeploy the whole hospital from a number of beds that were obviously non-located for COVID patients. Obviously, basically 2/3 of our beds were started to become dedicated to COVID patients. And emergencies and our emergency department was totally dedicated to COVID patients. It was probably impossible to access for any other reason. And this was concerning, obviously, at the beginning, because we didn't have any space and nobody was coming to our hospital. And we had more than 90 patients a day. And this is the evolution of our ICU beds in our department in time. As you can see, at the beginning of February, we had just some beds dedicated to the first patients that were coming up. And we stretched to the limit, increasing our beds to nearly 100 beds, ICU beds, and most of them were for COVID patients. Only after mid-April did we manage to have more beds than COVID patients, so we could admit emergencies or start operating, let's say, elective, complicated, or high-risk patients. So for more than 2 months, we could not do anything else but accommodate COVID patients. And this was a drama, obviously, if you consider our admittance, as you can see, between 2019 to 2020, as you can see in the blue, this is our normal ward activity of urological patients with difficult conditions. Urology has a number of benign, but also bad oncological patients. And you can see that this dropped. The ward basically had to collapse and dedicate itself to giving our beds to COVID patients. A 90% drop was expected. And we started asking questions. Most of these questions have partially been answered by now. But at the beginning of March, we started to ask ourselves, how can we define, select and prioritize oncological patients? What shall we do with these patients? Shall we defer them? Shall we send them somewhere else? How long can we wait before we can treat them? We didn't know it would last only, let's say, 2 months. It could have been a year long. Which guidelines shall we follow? None at the beginning. Should we decide by ourselves? Shall we centralize decision? Shall we talk to the board? Shall we talk to the state? Who shall we include in our decision making? Because basically at the end of the day, it's us with the patient. But these decisions seemed bigger than personal. Consider also that by mid-March, nearly 60% of medical staff of my colleagues were infected, either positive at swabs or actually home with pneumonia. And 30% of the remaining was completely dedicated, as I said to you before, to COVID patients. So what happened to surgery? Basically, surgery was cut down. We could only do what we had to do. Nearly 90% of our surgery was stopped. And this seems obvious now, but then we were basically doing this, and around us, not far from us, people were still operating. Because as I said, our region was the most hit, and this was very, very concerning. And most importantly, oncological surgery, people who had to be operated, who without an operation would have gone maybe in front of a progression, or things would have been more dangerous for them. So as you can see, we made our decisions. We decided to operate. This is very technical, urological, but generally speaking, we treated locally advanced cancer, kidney cancer, bladder cancer, obviously testicular cancer. And as things happen, we had strange cases coming in just in this period. We had strange sarcomas, a very aggressive adrenal cancer. So we had to make these choices. And luckily, in time, 1 month after, our choices retrospectively were supported by guidelines, or basically national, let's say, we call them guidelines, but they were recommendations really. The problem was, as you know, generally speaking, high-risk patients, oncological, also require intensive care unit often, and we could not do these patients. So we had to compromise oncological problems and the fact that they should not need ICU. There was no place for these patients. So this was another big compromise, and we felt obviously alone. So we tried writing to basically make ourselves known to the public and hopefully receive also some feedback in this respect. Also, interestingly, we never closed our outpatient clinic. This was a very, very not straightforward decision, but we decided courageously, I think, to reduce by 50%. And we obviously kept open emergency consultations, and our door was open for any oncological patients who required an urological evaluation. But interestingly, nearly 25% of the patients who could have come didn't come because they preferred to not come to the hospital. Basically, it was quite appreciated, and they took by the letter the fact that we were encouraging people to stay away from the hospital. As I said before, our hospital was becoming the vehicle of infection. What happened to the emergency? Obviously, you can never close a door to somebody who comes from outside. But obviously, from a 40 patients an hour regime, we went to 100 patients an hour regime. And just for 3 weeks, nobody came in for other disease. And this was quite worrying, because where were these patients going? Consider also that hospitals, smaller hospitals around, completely closed. They didn't even become hubs, they just closed their activity. So for 4 weeks, we didn't register any urological emergency. So we still don't know what happened to those patients. Interestingly enough, the relative numbers didn't decrease. We performed nearly 29 surgical approaches, urgent, and these were obviously urosepsis, hematuria, torsions, kidney fractures, because obviously things still happen. But usually we experience more accidents, we have more traumas, and obviously these were zero. But as I said, for 4 weeks, nobody came to our department for emergencies in urology. So basically, where are we heading? We're heading towards 0.5 R0, which is happening these days. Obviously, we're very uncertain. But obviously, challenges are happening every day. Now, we're trying to balance the need to start again. We all need to operate, but obviously, we're still worried that something else will happen. And what will happen when it happens again? Because we are still a COVID hub. We still have approximately 5 to 10 patients with a positive swab with symptoms that come in every day. And we cannot open our activities of more than 70%, because just in case something else happens. And this obviously is compromising our normal activity, because we would like to open our doors and operate as before or even more than before. But this is impossible because, as you can see, our hospital has been now in the last few weeks relocated and changed. We still have 4 COVID wards and 1 for multidisciplinary surgery. These patients are positive patients with a swab who require surgery, who do not have more symptoms. We have 3 dedicated operating rooms. Normally, we have 3 out of 57 operating rooms. We have 1 dedicated ICU, dedicated emergency rooms, and interestingly, we have a now closing field hospital in a fair complex, which was used during the surge. This was a very, very important thing that happened after nearly 40 days from the beginning of the crisis. Just to show you a diagram, I don't expect you to read it, it's also in Italian, but this is what's happening now. Patients who require a visit or a procedure, any procedure will be swabbed, and within 72 hours will be either operated or will be admitted to the hospital. And we are still seeing now 15% of positive swabs of patients who need to undergo surgery. So we are also redefining the concept of deferrability of these patients. So what do you do with a positive swab? You operate, you have to reconsider what kind of emergency or priority this patient has. These are still unknowns, obviously. I'm just showing you a lot of the questions we are asking ourselves. But when we see what's happening in the world of urology, but as I said, applicable to anything, we will probably be unable to satisfy all the patients who have been left behind. This is probably unrealistic, and unfortunately, things will happen. Some patients will progress, some patients will die from their disease. Things will have to be obviously taken as they come. It is very difficult to estimate how long it will take to get back to normality, if we ever get back to there. The big problem is, as you can see from this projection from the NHS, which is slightly different from our reality, it was estimating a 20% of increase in normal activity, and we are currently 70% compared to the 100%. So we will have to increase 50% if we consider this slide. It will take 11 months and a lot of money to get back to normal. So considering our 70%, I don't know if we will ever make it within 2 or 3 years. And if you consider the oncological patients included, this is not a time for them to be treated, obviously. So this is very concerning. Interestingly, we have explored different ways of avoiding patients to come into the hospital. This is another key of accelerating the number of outpatient visits, reducing the risk of being infected. And this interesting paper showed that telemedicine, which we started to do tentatively, can be interesting. 55% of the patients who were eligible to the criteria of telemedicine were willing to actually perform it. And interestingly enough, it was those who had worse disease and were, let's say, with more comorbidities who actually were more eligible to telemedicine. So this could be obviously another way of at least starting to see and stratifying patients. At least the waiting list of outpatient clinics can be reduced. Surgery obviously is another question at all. So my conclusion, I'm sorry if I ran a bit through the presentations, but the idea was also to leave space for some questions eventually. So from the center of the storm, as I said, we were the first, unfortunately. It was a very challenging and highly challenging task. A lot of mistakes were made. As I said, considering the hospital as a hub, as a center of the pandemic, probably generated another pandemic inside the pandemic. We did not know anything about the enemy. We don't know how to cure it. Most of the data we spoke about before in the interesting presentation came from mistakes, from tentative approaches to therapy, obviously. But the big task is actually going back to normality. As I said before, we need to be careful of a second wave, and it will be difficult without a second wave. I'm not sure what will happen if we do have a second wave. Also because next time, I'm sure no mistakes will be admitted as we have had, obviously, this time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. Great talk, and really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And a few questions I wanted to ask, and thanks for sharing your screen. So first question is, what ramifications do you expect or have you seen from people not seeking out medical attention for non-COVID related conditions? So delaying going into being seen, et cetera, as a result of what's happening.
Well, it's quite early, to be honest. I think it will take 6 months to actually see the effects of oncologically, let's say, progression of disease. Now, obviously, a lot of patients are coming with concealed emergencies, let's say, things that were kept quiet and are coming out. And we've seen a peak in emergency surgery. This is obvious. But I think the real problem will be assessing the silent deaths, because a lot of people who will die will not be probably diagnosed as being COVID-related deaths, but I will consider these patients as COVID-related deaths. So I think it will take a long and difficult epidemiological approach to actually count the, unfortunately, our deaths. What I can say, though, is that what I've seen is something which was incredible. My hospital has stretched all the professionals involved, nurses and doctors, obviously. We've opened our limits, basically opening our spaces. We've tried to get to the limit of our capacity in terms of looking after these patients, at least phoning them. We phoned at least 500 patients in the last 3 weeks, asking what's going on and how are they. Consider that we had also a big problem because we've had so many deaths on our medical practitioners on the ground. Mm-hmm. So we have had a reduction in the territorial medicine. And this is another big problem because they've lost a lot of what we wanted, so territorial medicine to happen. So right, this is a big concern.
Definitely a hard topic to talk about. And thank you, Richard, for sharing that, and especially since we see the images of what was happening on social media and on the news, and Italy being ahead of, in terms of timeline from where we are. This follow-up question kind of speaks to that and really speaks to helping, the Ontario and Canadian situation here figure out how our modeling may work. And so this question is, does the number of COVID cases reporting now follow the forecasting models built before, in which cases were predicted for future days? So is the model that Italy was relying upon, was it effective? Was it working? And did that help you all make arrangements for some of the oncological patients and surgeries? Was the follow-up question?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Interesting question. Basically, there are two different scenarios. If we must decide and look at the people who are actually dying or being admitted with symptoms, I would say yes. So the lockdown has worked. And as you can see, you probably saw the numbers, it has dropped. The number of cured patients has increased and has outnumbered the number of symptomatic patients. If I must judge just by the positive patients, this is impossible because the scheme of swabbing patients has changed dramatically within weeks. Sometimes they swab 10,000 patients and the positive patients will go up. Other weeks they swab just 100 patients, and so apparently no more positive cases. So the positivity is undeciphered. We cannot decipher this. But if I must judge by the admittance of patients in ICU and in A&E department, I would say, yes, things have dropped dramatically. I have not seen a patient with CPAP within weeks now.
Great, so, and just
fingers crossed.
Another question here: as Ontario, so we're in Canada, plans to ramp up our elective surgeries, which is what we're starting to do now, what are some of the pearls that you've gone through to help us be successful?
So basically, the big rule is discuss each patient with the patient with a multidisciplinary approach. Accurate swabbing and deferring patients who are positive and do not need surgery. We had to increase the nursing network. We created a network where patients talk to the nurses and describe obviously their situation and are helped from a psychological point of view also to wait. We must teach patients to wait. And this is not easy. So we define with pneumologists, infectivologists, specialists, each case, but we are redefining in neurology. This is another interesting point which I didn't actually talk for time in my presentation. We are redefining which patients really need surgery. This is something amazing. Basically, as urologists, but I'm sure this applies to many specialties, probably we were over-treating a lot of patients. So basically, redefining indications, redefining priorities has helped probably us as a surgical community to understand what was going on before, because not everything we did was perfect also, because we were basically operating just because we could operate, not because it was necessary sometimes. And this was specific for urology in many, many conditions, benign condition, functional conditions. So priorities have changed, definitely. So this is my idea, is to help everybody sort of re-look into themselves. This is useful, and probably redistribute resources. As you know, you said it before, I worked in Africa as well, where there weren't 100% of resources. You couldn't give everything to everybody. Whilst in European, or let's say Western culture, everything should be given to everybody, which is possibly nice to know, but it's not always possible. And this COVID has taught us this, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, Richard. Just one other question here we have. So we know that anxiety in elective surgery is prevalent and can climb up to numbers of 80% depending on its severity. Has this number shifted with the increased distress related to COVID? And if so, how have you adjusted your practices? How do you address that with some of the patients that are speaking about this too?
So basically, our psychological department was the most involved in non-COVID activities. They had to they had to increase their workload. So we've had two kinds of stress. Obviously, we've had stress for doctors and obviously let's say the medical personnel in general, and we have had counseling. But as I said to you, in our teamwork, in our team-based environment, we always do psychological consultation to each patient. They have to be seen by a psychologist, whether they're COVID positive or non. And this is made just for this purpose, to help them understand that medicine isn't about the single patient anymore in this phase. It's about a community medicine. So people have to try. It's not easy because each patient for us doctors is 100% of our priority. But we must try to help reasoning that something that is okay for one single person might not be okay for the whole community. It's not easy. It's not an easy task, especially in a Latin country. Although we are a few kilometers from Switzerland, we are still a Latin country. And this is not easy. And a psychologist can help also the family to understand why we are not operating a patient, why things are being delayed, why we have chosen to do something else, why the waiting list isn't what it was meant to be in January or February. And this has a lot of also legal reasons, both for the patient and for the doctors, because as I said, no doctor has to be left by himself with these decisions, and no patient has to be left by himself with the consequences of this decision.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard, for those parting words. And again, truly appreciate you taking the time, and really thank you for sharing your experiences again, and nice to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Great. So great talking. So our next speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Daniel Figueroa Tentori. And Daniel is a hepatopancreatobiliary surgeon in Mexico City, currently working at the American British Cowdray Medical Center. Dr. Tentori graduated from medical school at Anahuac University in Mexico, and subsequently he was granted a national scholarship to further obtain his PhD at the University College of London. He accomplished his general surgery residency at Hospital General de Mexico. Further on, Dr. Tentori achieved his fellowship in HPB surgery at the Advent Health in Orlando, with further training in advanced HPB robotic surgery at UPMC. After his training abroad, he devoted his first 2 years developing the HPB department at the National Medical Center, 20 de November, ISSTE in Mexico City. Dr. Tentori's clinical practice is focused in hepatopancreatobiliary, benign and malignant diseases. He is an active member of the IHPBA and AHPBA being part of different committees, and most recently, he achieved a surgical leadership scholar program at Harvard Medical School. And with that, I'd like to introduce Daniel.
Hello, Michael. Thanks a lot. I want to thank you guys for the invitation. It's an honor for me to give this talk, and I will quickly give you an overview about what we're doing in Mexico. Let's see. Can you see it properly or not? There you go.
And yeah, if you could just share your screen again, Daniel, before there's a...
Is it shared already?
We're just seeing you yourself. Can't see the slides yet. So there's...
There you go.
Perfect, we got it.
Got it? Perfect. So thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So what we are going to go through, the previous lectures gave a tremendous and amazing talks, and I'm going to go through a little bit of what happened in Mexico. So as we all know, this happened, it started in December 2019 in Wuhan, China. And 2 months later, apparently we have the first reported case. I'm saying apparently because we never know, right? Because the tests were available until maybe February, and then there was a little bit misguided stuff about the diagnosis. So in Mexico City, we have 120 million population all around Mexico. And this was the cases that we were seeing. Around 67% of them, we ended up having them at home. And then only 32% of those patients with COVID positive ended up having to be admitted into hospital. And this was mainly because of respiratory insufficiency. That was the main criteria for hospitalization. As we can see, as Richard Nasper, our good friend, all the deaths that had happened unfortunately in Italy, there were a lot, but unfortunately in Mexico, we're having a lot of cases, and now we became the 7th position about death due to COVID. As we can see here in this chart, the number of cases, and this will give you amount of the ages of the people, and most of the people that are getting infected are among the 35 to 50%, 55 years old, 44% men, and it's pretty much the same ratio about men and women. And since May, as we're showing this chart, it has been increasing all the numbers. As of yesterday, we are going into above 150,000 people. And this is a map so everybody get an idea about in Mexico, what we're seeing, and you know that the President Donald Trump is focusing mainly on the areas that we share a border, and we can see in pink in the area of Baja California, which is Tijuana, in the border. Indeed, there's a lot of cases over there, but it's mainly in the main Mexico City where we're seeing a lot, and not a lot of in the other areas of Mexico. However, this is increasing, the dissemination is increasing. And this is due mainly because of discrepancies about among our government policies, not enough testing for COVID-19, and is insufficient health public system. So in Mexico, we have either the private or the public, and there's a big demand for the health public system, and so far we're not doing a very good job in that department. The main population here in Mexico, in our COVID positive population, most of them have hypertension, around 20%. Obesity is a main concern in our country. Diabetes, smoking, and badly because of the mortality in our country is going very high. It's reported to be around 11.8%. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the hospital I work in. It pretty much it's a private hospital. It has 2 campuses, and it's around Mexico City. And we have one campus, which is the Campus Observatorio. And this was created, our board members decided, since we have 2 hospitals in the main city, they decided pretty much to make one hospital a COVID hospital and the other one a COVID-free hospital. So this is the first hospital, which is in Observatorio, which is trying to put it as a COVID hospital. The other one is a Campus Santa Fe, is mainly in the hospital that I'm working, and this is a COVID-free hospital, and most of the other cases are going through there, and we're trying to do as much as possible to initiate all the normal medicine that we were used to be doing. So each hospital has 150 beds, and we have around 70 medical specialties. And so far in ABC Medical Center in Observatorio, we have treated around 200 cases with a 1% mortality. So far we're doing a pretty good job over there. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about a protocol that's going on that was implanted by the OR and the COVID group and the epidemiology department of my hospital. And they started to decide, as you were talking, Michael, how are we going to start doing our normal medicine, the normal cases that we have a very good demand of those. And so we started doing this in ABC Santa Fe, in the hospital that is COVID-free. And they implanted this protocol about 48 hours prior to surgery. We do a pre-op evaluation, either by internal medicine or pediatrics in terms of the patient population. And then we did a respiratory triage, and most of the patients go for a chest CT scan only if they're pregnant or their pediatric population, they don't go for that. And we do the swabs, the RT-PCR, COVID-2, and this goes for elective or emergency cases. So this protocol started in April, and so far we have done 11,134 cases of surgeries, emergencies and elective cases. And among the emergency surgeries, we have found only a 0.7% of COVID positive patients, and in elective cases, 1.2%. So whenever we identify these cases and we know they are positive, either in the emergency scenarios, if we find out about the case because we do a PCR responses will be around 6 to 8 hours. If the patient went into the OR prior to that, even if the chest CT scan was clear and we found out it was COVID positive, once the patient is out of the OR, we move the patient to the other hospital, and we do a sanitization of the OR and the whole establishment, and which is working very good. So far this protocol has established that it's doing very well, because we're doing it at 60% of our working capacity, which is good, and it's growing. So that brings up a lot of work now in this hospital. And lately we're starting to work on some serologic tests with IgG and IgM to make this process a little bit more quickly, because we all know the PCRs, they require a lot of time to actually get a result. We can get a very good view with the chest CT scan straight away, but we still don't have the evidence of COVID. We need some evidence. So it's either PCR in 6 hours, and we're working on antibodies serologic tests so we can have these results in 10 minutes. And it's a protocol in work in progress. I started doing this protocol in a community, in a home residency community, which a lot of people wanted to see whether we were living in a safe environment, regardless of the lockdown or not. So we started mounting this protocol. They started on May, and we have staff in this community residency of around 62 people of staff, and we're doing medical evaluation with a questionnaire of the respiratory triage. We're checking vital signs, most importantly, temperature, oxygen saturation, heart rate, and we're doing the immunological antibody test. So it's a single lane rapid COVID sure IgM test, which we will get a result in 2 to 5 minutes. And we're doing this every 12 days. And every positive result, as you can see over there, whenever we get a positive, we have to correlate it with our RT-PCR. And so far since May, we're getting very good results. This is an ongoing protocol, so I'm going to show you later on whenever we get the chance, but it looks promising, and most likely because the people are getting, they're at ease. When people are checking on them, when you're doing a sample, that brings the anxiety down, and so far it's doing very well. So I wanted to go very quick just to show you what we were doing and just to leave some time for questions if there's some.
You have the question for him too? Is it up on the screen? Great. Thank you, Daniel. And if you can unshare your screen again so we can see you. And let's see questions that we've got here. So here's a question. So Daniel, we know that social distancing measures and stay-at-home orders have been implemented worldwide. In our emergency department here locally, it seems as if patients are presenting with increased severity. Have you noticed a similar trend in Mexico City? Is it getting better? What are you seeing there?
That's a very good question, because at the beginning of the pandemic, we started from February, we started seeing very sick people, very, very sick people. And the ORs were getting, crowded. And so far, I believe that for the past couple of weeks, I've been seeing a lot of patients either asymptomatic or with very few symptoms of anosmia. And we're identifying antibodies on those people. PCR negatives. And I don't know if you guys have seen this, but even in the normal scenarios, when we do a PCR, which is positive, and then 10 days later on, we do another PCR, and some of them, they don't go negative. They continue being positive PCR, and that's a struggle because the patients are doing fine. They feel very well, and they want to go back. They don't want to be in isolation either from their home or anything. And so I'm seeing that it goes by waves. Sometimes our hospital could be less crowded, 70% occupancy, and then out of a sudden, then a week comes along and then it's 100% full. So it all depends. And now my government has been putting this kind of a lockdown, and we're starting to open all these places now. So even if we're in the peak, we're continuing to see a lot of cases. But in terms of the severity, I can tell you on my experience that I'm not in the ICU, is that I'm seeing a lot of patients that are not very, affected. There are pretty much very few symptoms.
Thanks, Daniel. I think there's a follow-up question here. How might we adjust messaging to ensure appropriate care at the right time?
Well, that's a good question. The most important thing in terms of whatever they are living, they have to be in good communication with their family doctor, right? And the thing is that the latest the last symptoms that we're seeing a lot is anosmia and these very, very mild symptoms. So they have to be aware of those mild symptoms and contact their family doctor, and they have to be tested. Because even if the disease is mild and it will not jeopardize our patients, the life of our patients, they can still spread it, right? And we don't know if how every individual will get the disease, how affected it could be. So it is very important to be in contact with their family doctors.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak to us here, sharing your experiences in your part of the world. Thanks again, and nice to see you again.
Thank you, Michael. See you.
Great, thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Morris. And Dr. Andrew Morris is a professor in the Department of Medicine, a Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Toronto, and a consultant in infectious diseases and general internal medicine at Sinai Health System and University Health Network in Toronto. He is the director of the SHS-UHN Antimicrobial Stewardship Program. He obtained his medical degree at the University of Toronto, where he also completed specialty certification in internal medicine and subspecialty certification in infectious diseases. Dr. Morris also completed a master's degree in epidemiology from the Harvard School of Public Health. His research interests are in the areas of infectious diseases, pharmacotherapy, and antimicrobial stewardship. And with that, welcome to the stage, Dr. Morris.
Thank you. I think you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So really pleasure to be speaking to you right now. I'm going to try and cover my perspectives on COVID-19 in 20 minutes, or COVID-19 in 20. I'm trying to remember who the American media celebrity who wondered why it wasn't called COVID-20 rather than COVID-19, and speculated because it's been around for such a long time, or they were confused. I want to review what I think you need to know, and I don't want to make any predictions about the future that won't hold true. I want to be relatively brief, give a fair amount of time for questions. My summary is that, and it sounds like you've had a relative bunch of presenters already on this, but it's the worst health crisis in our lifetime. It's primarily a droplet spread infection. It's a pipe dream to reduce mortality without reducing cases. Reducing cases requires a forward-thinking public health and healthcare system, something that I'm going to say was lacking in round one in Ontario. And the current standard of care in Ontario remains supportive care, although I will argue that the current best care in Ontario is now dexamethasone 6 milligrams for 10 days. It is the worst health crisis in our lifetime. As of today, you can see here, there's been 444,000 deaths worldwide. By the time we're done with this, we'll have well over 1 million, and we'll probably have, unfortunately, several million deaths globally. And this trumps many of the diseases that we've encountered over the last century. I'll get to them in a second. One of the things that I've talked repeatedly about has been the relationship, or the lack of wisdom of having a lockdown and sacrificing the economy rather than emphasizing protecting vulnerable people. This, in fact, was the Swedish approach. Early on in the disease, many people were actually championing the Swedish approach. There were many op-eds, including in Canadian newspapers and magazines, touting the potential benefit, unproven benefit of Sweden. I still hear people talk about Sweden, and so I show you this slide to emphasize that Sweden has been an unmitigated disaster. Their strategy was to really try and nudge people to social distance without really any major public health measures, and in particular emphasize protecting vulnerable populations. And you can see here that this was really a massive disaster. On top of that, whereas the other Scandinavian countries are starting to open their borders to each other and share, Sweden is being excluded from that. And as you can see here, the rise in deaths has continued somewhat unabated. The head of their public health agency, their epidemiologist, was interviewed a couple of weeks ago and really tempered his thoughts around this and said that had they known what they know now, they may have been able to battle the virus better. I think this is a bit of hubris, and because of what we know about exponential growth in pandemics, I absolutely think that the best and most important measures are aggressive ones. From a public health as well as a clinical importance, I think one of the things that I want to highlight here, and for some reason one of my text box isn't showing up, but what you can see here is down here is the total number of cases. This is in a cohort in Australia. And you can see here that the majority of people who they've identified, and part of this has to do with case identification, these are obviously symptomatic people, have cough. What I do want to highlight is about 32% of cases, 32% of cases do not have fever. So 69% of cases have fever, but fever is actually a very poor discriminating feature. And as I think was alluded to by the last speaker, things like anosmia and ageusia, or loss of taste, is also fairly common, but it still remains rather uncommon. It's only at 15 to 20% of people, as far as we can tell. Something that's been near and dear to my heart has been the debate around droplet versus aerosol spread. This has taken a life of its own in many healthcare settings and even outside healthcare settings. To remind everyone, airborne transmission refers to very small or light particles that remain suspended in air, and so they can be carried in air for quite a long distance. And there are very few infectious diseases that we know that are primarily airborne. Tuberculosis, measles, chickenpox, inhalational anthrax, smallpox, those are diseases that are airborne, extremely uncommon, and viral infection in particular can occur with droplet spread, with airborne spread, but they're usually rather small virus particles. For droplet spread, what you have are particles that are larger and or heavier, and because of that, they get weighted down after they leave the host. Generally speaking, we think that the distance that they travel is 6 feet or less. That's probably somewhat inaccurate, and almost certainly there's a wide range of distances. The evidence supporting 6 feet as the sort of the defining distance between hosts is probably not perfect, but it's certainly a reasonable one. This paper came out 2 weeks ago, was a systematic review and meta-analysis commissioned by the World Health Organization. And I'm just going to read to you this concluding remark here, that face mask use could result in a large reduction in risk of infection with stronger associations with N95 or similar respirators compared with disposable surgical masks or similar. This is on a heavy background of a variety of different lobbies who have been very interested in guaranteeing that everyone who could potentially have occupational exposure to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, that they have N95 masks. There were several problems with this study. I don't want to go into it in detail, but I will say that there was relevant data that they omitted in an unexplained manner. So they took some studies and included some of the data from some studies in one comparison, but then in the very same study, from the very same study, they omitted data. They didn't account for current evidence or current experience. And they made this comparison, including in the conclusions here, comparing N95 and surgical masks when there was really no head-to-head data that they presented in their meta-analysis. And as I just mentioned, this has garnered a lot of attention, including in Ontario. Comments such as this: Ontario healthcare worker infections jumped 44% in 8 days. This was a press release by CUPE, who were arguing that every healthcare worker needs N95. We do know that about almost 17% of Ontarians with a positive COVID-19 test are healthcare workers. There's almost certainly some sampling bias here, but we don't really know the breakdown of the healthcare workers. And almost certainly the majority of cases have been associated with long-term care and a lack of PPE rather than the inadequate PPE that was supplied. And this has really muddied the conversation. It's resulted in lawsuits already against the provincial government, and it's caused grief to a variety of different health systems, including now dentists, where you have the Royal College of Dental Surgeons of Ontario arguing that it's okay to have a face shield and a surgical mask for most procedures, and the College of Dental Hygienists of Ontario arguing that every procedure requires an N95 mask. The thing that I think everyone has been most interested or concerned about from the very start has been averting a disaster. And I want to emphasize that I don't fault governments for changing targets. And we will find, and we have seen already, that governments have changed their targets. So the initial goals were preventing the overwhelming of the healthcare system. Now it seems that there's a different strategy and target, although we don't really know what that is, and I'll get there in a second. This is obviously the military fleet carrying coffins of COVID-19 in Bergamo, Italy. And, so everyone initially saw the images from Bergamo, which, was an outbreak that started after a soccer match in Milan, where roughly half of the population of Bergamo went and watched it, gathered together before, during, and after the match, and then returned back to Bergamo. And then the other disastrous place that everyone was worried that would be replicated was New York City. This is an image of a forklift. This is the red forklift here, carrying COVID-19 victims into a refrigerated truck. This was disseminated quite widely, this image that was posted on Twitter. And at one point, in a 7-hour span in New York City, the deaths were so frequent that over 100 people died in a span of 7 hours. And, how do we avert disasters? So from my perspective, and from what we've learned from COVID-19, the ways to avert disaster are to limit human movement so that containment strategies can work. You implement social or physical distancing measures, including early isolation. You implement widespread mask use in public, and we can have a discussion if anyone wants about the issue of public masking. You test, contact, and isolate, and you also help people isolate rapidly. You do surveillance. You use data science to modify your strategy. You ensure adequate resources, and that would be primarily hospital beds, ventilators, PPE, medications. And you communicate clearly, consistently, and effectively. How did we do? So the limiting of human movement was somewhat delayed, but I'll still give it a check mark, even though myself and others called on the federal government well before they did stop international movement to cut it down. And we still didn't have as much reduction in movement between regions in our country as we could have. You implement social or physical distancing measures, including early isolation. That was done fairly early, and in Ontario, I would say that we did quite well here. A huge disappointment to me and others has been the lack of implementation of or mandating of mask use in public. It totally baffles me why, with what we understand currently, that this hasn't become a primary provincial strategy, even though some municipalities are starting to take this up, and it is certainly within their constitutional right to do so. Testing, contact tracing, and then isolating patients, and then more equally importantly, helping those who can't isolate to isolate rapidly. As I think everyone knows, this has been a huge disaster. It has really improved dramatically in the past several weeks, but it's a little bit too little too late in my perspective. We are not doing sufficient surveillance on the ground, and that would be going to areas of high congregation, including places where people shop, worship, etc., and identifying prevalence rates there. We have been quite poor at using data science to modify our strategy. Again, it's picking up a little bit. I think Jane Philpott being hired as a special advisor around a data strategy for the province is a huge move in the right direction. Ensuring adequate resources. So we did great with hospital beds and ventilators, quite poorly with PPE, and it's uncertain about medications. The province really doesn't know, in particular around PPE and medication supply as well as they should. And the last thing, which I'll be heavily critical of, is the inability to communicate clearly, consistently, and effectively. I think the overall communication has been poor. We don't know whether any of the following are beneficial: prone positioning, early intubation, plasma exchange, convalescent plasma therapy, and tocilizumab, which inhibits IL-6. We know that hydroxychloroquine is not beneficial. Lopinavir, ritonavir is probably not beneficial. Remdesivir, there are 2 randomized controlled trials, one in China, a smaller one done by the NIH, primarily in the USA, and that was substantially larger. These are anyone basically who got admitted to hospital. And what you can see here, this is people recovering well enough to be discharged home. And you can see here that there's a pretty reasonable separation between remdesivir and placebo. It is not mother's milk, however. It is nowhere near as a great an improvement as we'd expect. This 14-day mortality, which is about 4.8% absolute risk reduction, so about 20 people would need, or 22 people would need to be treated to see benefit. We don't know what it is at 28 days. It's not statistically significant. And we are still waiting more data on remdesivir, but it seems to be beneficial. The only problem is it's really not available in most places in Canada, except in studies. And then lastly, dexamethasone, which was released in a press release yesterday, where they've received a lot of grief over this, that it was released in a press release, where 6 milligrams of dexamethasone for 10 days improved mortality compared to placebo. In ventilated patients, the number needed to treat was 8 to save a life. And for other patients, it was 25. This is one of the most amazing number needed to treat I've ever seen. I really do want to see the data, as do many others, but we await those results. And I'm going to stop.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Morris. That was great. There is a question here. So after SARS, a stockpile of PPE was collected for future pandemics, but this was forgotten and the stockpile expired. What other strategies would you recommend to ensure adequate resources for the future?
So I think the most important thing is that there needs to be an authority that is meant to be responsible for watching that. It should probably be Public Health Ontario along with the Ministry of Health, and they should be reviewing that regularly. So why that didn't occur is beyond my understanding, to be honest with you.
And Andrew, if you don't mind, just unshare your screen for this portion,
sure.
if that's okay. Another question is you outlined the slides for what we had difficulty accomplishing during this first wave. Do you think we'll be able to accomplish those items for the potential second wave?
I'm optimistic for some of it. I think if we're lucky, and we're going to need, unfortunately, to rely on some degree of luck, we'll be able to contain more than we were able to in the first wave. We obviously have a better understanding of the vulnerable populations. But in my mind, to be able to adequately control clusters and outbreaks, we need to be doing testing in areas where there's going to be a high concentration of people. That is schools and universities, congregate workspaces and congregate shopping areas, and all those areas and places of worship. All those areas, we really need frequent testing to be able to get on the ground understanding. Because if we're waiting, much like what's happening in the southern and western US, it'll be too late. Once we start seeing hospitalizations, the horse is already out of the barn.
Great. And as we're ramping up our surgical services, elective surgical services in the province, and as we're ramping up some of our diagnostic imaging services and other types of programming, where do you think we could optimize to really get the success of these programs off the ground?
I don't think that those areas are going to be too problematic when the incidence of disease and the prevalence of disease is low. I think the real challenge here is being able to balance all the resource needs with what may happen if we see a substantial surge. And that's really all balanced by our ability to surveil what's going on. So if we have low surveillance, what could happen is we'll be comfortable getting back to upscaling our services and increasing the throughput of patients. And then all of a sudden, we'll find that we'll have a surge of admissions coming upon us, and we will not have prepared in the same manner that we did in the first wave. And that's, I think, my biggest concern. Additionally, I'm really concerned that we just don't have all the supplies that we need, and we haven't done the full analysis to understand if we have PPE supply, medication supply. I'm really concerned about the PPE supply. In particular, the fact that governments are collecting numbers of PPE, but they're not validating the quality of the PPE. And so if we have 50 million gloves, but 20 million of them are defective, we don't have 50 million gloves. And the same thing goes with masks, shields, et cetera. So that's what I'm really concerned about.
Another question we have here is that you've mentioned communication as being a challenge, and we have been bombarded with COVID communication on almost every information medium. Perhaps the type of communication is a factor. For example, you revealed alarming issues with messages about COVID not being only droplet spread. What role did the press play in potentially mismessaging, or was the message right, or what is your thought on that?
As someone who's interacted with the media quite a bit during this, I would say overall the media response, as well as the majority of experts that they've had give information, has actually been quite good. I've been pretty pleased with that. I really hold a lot of this, apart from the whole sort of hoax, fake news stuff that's been disseminated on social media, things like plandemic or whatever. I think really a much bigger problem has been the lack of a singular voice, confusing messages by different officials in different jurisdictions. We have this, I was thinking about giving the whole talk just on the lack of governance around public health in Canada. We have the Public Health Agency of Canada, who has a role in Ontario. We have the Ministry of Health. We have Ontario Health. We have Public Health Ontario, and we have the Chief Medical Officer of Health. And they're all interfaced in some way, but it's poorly coordinated. And then on top of that, below, you have the people who are most responsible for public health in Ontario, which are the regional public health units. So your regional public health unit is your most important public health structure, but it's complicated by the fact that they have to, your medical officer of health has to interface and coordinate and align things with all these other organizations. And it results in confusing messaging, poor data structures. I blame that as the number one problem we've had, and I don't blame any one person. It's an institutional and governance problem.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, and sharing that with us here today.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Great. So our next speaker is Dr. Kylie Booth. Dr. Booth obtained her medical degree and emergency medicine fellowship from the University of Toronto. Dr. Booth was an emergency physician at North York General Hospital until 2011, when she moved to Collingwood, Ontario. Dr. Booth has been the Chief of Emergency Medicine at CGMH since 2013. She has a special interest in undergraduate and postgraduate medical education, and she holds faculty appointments in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto and McMaster University. She has a special interest in rural trauma preparedness, emergency point-of-care ultrasound, and leadership training. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Booth.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for sharing this morning with me. Wonderful presentations this morning, and a real flavor of the international impact of this pandemic. I hope in the next 10 or so minutes to bring you the Collingwood perspective, to tell you what our team has done to meet head on this COVID-19 challenge, which has been challenging. I'm going to start with a little quote: "Necessity is the mother of invention." And indeed, this proverb speaks volumes of the incredible work that our team has done here in the last 3 months. So I'm going to take you on a little story, I hope just to give you a flavor of what our team has been up to, and hopefully put some context into what the hospital has done to pivot itself to respond to this pandemic, and the preparedness that has happened at the front line. At no time in my career can I remember feeling so fortunate, really, to be involved with such an amazing team. I have never been so proud to speak on behalf of our emergency department and indeed our hospital at large, and to share with you on behalf of our team the innovation and the incredible, I would say, Herculean efforts that have gone into making our hospital prepared for what the first wave has been, and potentially what the future may hold. So I'm going to take you back here, back to March 13th. So the second week of March 2020, you heard from the folks in Bergamo. They were sort of in week 2 at that point of what was an incredible pandemic catastrophe, really. And so in Canada, if you can see sort of the middle here, we were still at a handful of cases, but indeed our ED was gearing up, and what we were gearing up for was the Ontario March break. So we had a very busy ski and snowboard season. Our team was ready to sort of rock the last of our ski and snowboard trauma, expecting busloads of city kids and our usual traffic to come through and fall on the ski hill and break their legs and separate their shoulders, and we were ready for that. We were a little tired after a busy winter season, and certainly some of our team was packing their bathing suits and flip-flops and ready for a beach vacation, myself included. Those were not to be. And so we were kind of worn out already going into this. And then, as you remember, our national papers were reporting the coronavirus, as it was called then, and it hadn't yet changed to sort of SARS-CoV or COVID-19, as has now entered our lexicon and been, I think, probably every second word that we're saying. And so when we were looking at the images coming out of China and coming out of Italy, I can say that the sentiment of our colleagues here in the hospital, nursing, respiratory therapists, physicians, mental health specialists, we were frightened. We were frightened. We were communicating feverishly with each other. We were communicating feverishly with our colleagues at OSMH, at RVH in Midland, in Toronto, and indeed around the world, to say, what is this beast that we will be facing and how can we best prepare ourselves? We were communicating at all hours. We were communicating at 5 a.m, and I would send texts out to my colleagues and they would text me back because they too were awake. We were following the horrifying stories, and we were facing a reality of a virus that was going to potentially overwhelm our system. We heard about patients with profound hypoxia. We heard about healthcare workers and the impact on infectivity in Bergamo, PPE supplies, and indeed, we were worried that we didn't either. We were worried that we didn't have enough ventilators. We were worried that March break was arriving, and our catchment area of CGMH, which is usually 60,000 permanent residents, welcomes on an annual year 3.5 million visitors, with the majority of those coming in the winter ski season and to our friends at Blue Mountain, which we usually love, but certainly panic started to strike. We recognized that our little hospital with 74 beds, a small ICU, and really 2 ventilators at that point, was going to be hard pressed to manage that influx. And we were nervous and we were scared. It felt like walking a tightrope. Many of our colleagues wrote letters to our children, worried that we will be infected, that we would suffer great losses. We set up our garages as a doffing station so that when we came home from work, we could get naked in our garages and run to our showers to ensure that our kids didn't hug us first. Numbers went through our heads every night. And really, it was a night terror that in the reality, our system could become overwhelmed. What I want to tell you about is some of the highlights that this fear and this panic and this worry stimulated. And the first one is teamwork. The second one is the importance of our simulation program. And the third one is the adaptability of our team that planned, did, study, and repeated. And so I'll highlight a few of these. The first image I'll share with you is a picture early on taken of our frontline team, who really galvanized around this challenge. This is us standing here when one of our generous local donors provided these face covers, these head shields for us. And this was the day that one of our other colleagues pulled into the ambulance bay and delivered these face shields. And this was really galvanizing for us because we relied on each other and we really felt like we were going to be in this together. And that was enormously protective and helpful, I think. We also had wonderful team member support with our Georgian Bay Family Health team, our Collingwood General and Marine Foundation, among others, our local radio stations, our local newspapers, and friends of the hospital, including all of the towns in the surrounding areas and their administration structures. This is a shot here on the right-hand side of two of our family health team nurse practitioners who were staffing our assessment tent, which we erected sort of in 2 days' time in the front of the hospital. What we did here is we processed all of our patients coming into the hospital through our assessment entry, and we're able to do what's called fry screening as well as a COVID assessment to sort out whether or not these patients were recent travelers, whether they were presenting with infectious complaints. And this was an enormous assistance in what we hoped would be an ability to collate and sort our patients such that we wouldn't be overwhelmed in the emergency department. We, a few years ago, as many of you remember, launched a simulation program here, a high fidelity simulation program. And so this is two of our physicians, Doctors Guscott and Orling, who are practicing on this mannequin, who we affectionately named Colin G. Wood. And our simulation program allowed us to, with our respiratory therapists, Jess Metherall, with some of our physicians, Drs. Guscott, Orling, Dr. Bolton, a number of them. Basically, what we did was we said, how are we going to do this? We need to simulate this before these patients arrive and see what are our blind spots, what we do well, what we don't do well. And this was an enormously helpful program that we ran a number of our frontline staff through. We ran everything from putting on and putting off our PPE and having these simulation moments to say, hey, listen, you just touched your face when you took off that piece of equipment and you need to start again. And this was an enormous opportunity for us to both look at our processes as well as see our weaknesses, as well to bring these events to our front line before they actually happened, both to make people comfortable and confident in their PPE, as well as comfortable and confident in some of the procedures that they may be expected to encounter in the weeks to come. And so this cycle was really helpful to bring that anxiety and that fear level down amongst our community. We had to adapt. And as we did this, we discovered our weaknesses. So as I said, we started off with a tent out front of the hospital in hopes that we could collate and steer patients from a green to a yellow zone, green being, we're not worried you have COVID, and yellow being, you might have COVID, and so we need to isolate you appropriately. And we discovered that, you know, once we flipped and pivoted our emergency department, then we discovered through more evidence that came out that perhaps our screening wasn't as robust as it could be, and that maybe those monikers of green and yellow weren't adequate to fully capture who was infected and who was not. And so, as I said, we did a PDSA cycle after a PDSA cycle after a PDSA cycle. And the word that comes to mind to describe our team as we pivoted and then pivoted again and then pivoted again is adaptability. And so with each step, our team was ready to say, this really works and we'll stick with it for now, or wow, this really doesn't work, but no worries, we're gonna try something different tomorrow. One of those, oh, don't worry, we'll try something different tomorrow, was we decided to embark on a mini renovation in our emergency department and putting some doors and some negative pressure capacity into our emergency department, which previously didn't exist. As many of you know, our emergency department is many years old and long past its best before date. And so we tried to create as best we could in our small footprint in our old infrastructure, the negative pressure and isolation capacity that we needed. This was a morning that started off great in that our renovations were happening at breakneck speed. But as you can see, the renovations, we didn't quite get all the measurements correct. So you can see that this stretcher potentially wouldn't fit through this lovely door that we had just cut. So as you can imagine, this was met with a few sighs and head scratches and who signed off on that? But I can just honestly say, I say it to a little bit tongue in cheek, because, you know, just a few days later, we had these lovely wide open doors where we could fit not only a stretcher, but a stretcher with numerous pieces of equipment and personnel, each going in and out of it. So I'd just like to give a hats off to our entire hospital and our hospital community who responded and has taken in stride both our wins as well as our guffaws in terms of being able to continue to pivot and operate at the highest level we could. Our simulation was also really important because as we simulated with our new personal protective equipment, we realized, this procedure that is intubation, which is bread and butter of emergency medicine and anesthesia in terms of securing an airway for someone and taking over their breathing, becomes very difficult when you're wearing a pair of glasses and you're behind a shield and you have 2 or 3 layers of plastic glare coming back at you. We also discovered we couldn't hear each other in this, and our steps had to be clear and precise, and we needed to practice more and more and more together such that we could anticipate what someone was saying and potentially work harder to read someone's lips. Some of our colleagues developed what's called the CGMH COVID-19 Protected Code Blue, and this is for patients who required emergency management of a pulseless rhythm or a what we call a code blue or a vital signs absent moment, recognizing that we needed to support both our patients who typically we would run in all guns a-blazing and immediately start resuscitation, recognizing that in the COVID era, this was not something that we could do anymore because we needed to protect our healthcare workers. Certainly you can imagine if we all ran into the room, started CPR and started bag valve masking, we would quickly aerosolize COVID up into the air of that room and infect not only the healthcare workers, but potentially other members of the hospital. As Dr. Nasser mentioned earlier, that became a big issue, obviously, in Bergamo, where their hospitals became the infection site. And so this was an enormous amount of work spearheaded by Drs. Bolton and Guscott to provide this protected code blue, and did much to move our team toward a coherent and uniform approach to these cases. What was nice was our team was learning together, our team was practicing together, and we continued to refine this and move our team forward. A number of modifications in terms of our equipment were put into place. So we created a COVID crash cart, which included our airway equipment, our monitors, and our drugs and IV equipment, recognizing that anytime we brought equipment into a potential COVID room, that equipment would have to be cleansed and or disposed of because of its presence in a contaminated space. And so we became very good at sorting out what limited equipment we could take into a room that was potentially infected, and recognizing that our stewardship of that equipment was enormously important, specifically our personal protective equipment and resuscitation equipment. Again, we separated out our ED flow into hot and cold zones, our green and yellow zones. And as I said, when evidence came to bear that perhaps our screening wasn't sensitive enough to pick up any and all of our cases, we then pivoted again and created a warm ED that had some hot zones as well. You know, I think thanks to our wonderful community, our volumes haven't yet, and knock on wood, outstripped our capacity, both in Collingwood and in the region, and it's indeed in the province. Our volumes actually have dropped quite considerably. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, 118 visits, was our day visit on March 1st, and about March 15th or March 12th rather, we hit 123. You can see a precipitous drop down to 92, then 76, and then a very slow creep down to a low of 36 at the end of March. Really we were seeing for most of March 30 to 50% of our usual volumes, which was quite concerning. We thought to ourselves, where did our patients go? Where are our appendicitis? Where are our heart attacks? Where are our strokes? And that was quite worrisome for us. And so we relied on local radio stations to put the word out that our emergency department and our hospital at large, indeed our Georgian Bay Family Health Team, had put into place numerous infectious infection prevention and control mechanisms to ensure safety, and that we were worried that non-COVID presentations of acute illness were not coming, and we were very worried about where those patients were. And I think that in 6 months and a year, we potentially will get to the bottom of where those patients go. But at this time, I guess we're thankful that we had a little bit of reprieve from our usual, high volumes over the end of ski season, to allow our teams to prepare, to practice, and to perfect really what we now understand as our new COVID reality and emergency department. I can tell you our emergency department volumes are now creeping back to almost normal. And despite the profound fatigue that I think our frontline team has of working in PPE for their long shifts, as well as all the preparations and changes that have gone on in the last 3 months, I think our team is ready and able now to care for what's coming through our doors. We feel confident in our personal protective equipment, and we feel ready should a second wave emerge. I think one of the overwhelming worries, and we heard some speakers talk about the mental health downstream effects of this, are the suffering that has happened due to the social isolation, the potential financial ruin of many small business owners and folks that don't have access to those usual mental health supports, whether they be family and friends, and indeed the sort of determinants of health, which include access to financial independence and whatnot. I think what we're seeing now is a profound, this is just a screenshot of my tracker the other day, and indeed our mental health presentations to the Emerge have surged, and we are doing our best to respond to that. And I think that that's, where our response will lead, depending on whether or not we have a second wave and whether or not restrictions are continued to be opened up going forward. But we are ready and indeed understanding the real sacrifice that our community has put forth, such that our volumes have been manageable, but recognizing that there are secondary and downstream effects of what has been an enormous effort by our community to isolate. I want to just highlight that, as we contemplate our future and look to our successes over the last 3 months, I think the overarching theme is that of the skill set of our rural generalists that are in Collingwood. So our emergency physicians, our family physicians, our GP anesthesia, our nurses, our social workers, our respiratory therapists, our RPNs, our allied health, our community of caring health professionals. A rural generalist is a special thing. And we saw this certainly a couple of years ago when we faced a code blue, and recognizing that rural generalists are able to, although small, be mighty and able to respond to new and novel realities that come forth. And certainly this pandemic, as I said, has been the most challenging of our careers thus far. As we contemplate what's next, I think we've learned many lessons. I think we're now more than ever, working as a team. We've elevated our game. We've, I think, punched above our weight class in terms of our preparedness, in terms of the publications, and our code blue has been shared around the province, indeed, to partners far and wide. And I think that our little team has led that charge because of their enormous skill set. And so while we were challenged with our very old and small physical infrastructure, we know that, if we were in a new hospital with large spaces where each patient could easily be isolated with a door and a negative pressure system, that wasn't our reality. But what has been our reality is the skill set of our rural generalists. And I do feel very proud and very grateful that we've been able to navigate this pandemic thus far together. as we go forward, our future steps, I think, we're proud and we've learned so much. I have a picture here of the masks that I sewed with my children as a project over March break. There was no elastic to be bought, so we took the elastic from my son's old Star Wars underpants. So when I think of where we've come so far. We've come from not being sure of our PPE supply locally to the generosity of donors in our community to a senior administration team that has worked tirelessly to ensure that we have the equipment that we need. An administration, I believe, that has listened to the front line and has been able to innovate and to pivot again, and to never say we shouldn't have done that, just to say we tried that and now we're going to move forward. So I'm very proud of our team. I want to congratulate the hard work and to thank our patients in our community who've worked so hard to socially isolate and indeed have created a situation where our planning and our preparedness has not been taxed as of now, but certainly we're ready should that need come. So a big thank you to Dr. Lisi for including me today, and I hope this has been a brief overview of your Collingwood Emerge and indeed your hospital and where we've come and where we're heading.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Booth. If you can maybe unshare your screen again there for a second, just for our question time frame. So the question that we have here is what changes to medical education and or medicine at more rural centers or medium-sized hospitals would you predict would come out of the COVID situation?
Well, I mean, medical education went on hold for a little bit in terms of our ability to welcome undergraduate and postgraduate learners. And that was mainly a PPE concern in terms of our ability to ensure that our learners had adequate protection. We are now welcoming those learners back through our emergency department and indeed into our community. It will be a PPE related issue in terms of whether or not we're able to support safely those learners reintegrating into our system. But certainly we have a lot to learn, and our department remains focused on our commitment to medical education. So I don't see a huge change in our capacity for teaching. I think we will want to welcome those learners whose time with us was put on hold in late March and April, recognizing some of those learners will have gone on to graduate now at the end of this school year. And so I think we'll be looking to increase those opportunities for those folks to come back through on an ad hoc basis if we can support their learning further. I think as everything has gone online, including my children's homeschooling, and recognizing that we can do a lot of things by Zoom, I think we have an enormous wealth of great teachers here in Collingwood. I think we can leverage the online platforms to make sure that we can be involved and continue to participate in those learning environments. And I think we have been in the past a hugely popular spot for medical education, and I believe that that continues going forward, and we'll look to welcome people in new and novel environments as we are able.
Fantastic, thank you, and thank you so much, Kylie, for taking the time to speak with us today. Greatly appreciated, and thanks for setting the stage of what's happening here locally. Thanks again.
It's my pleasure.
Great. So our final speaker is Dr. Mark Quigg, and Dr. Mark Quigg is a local family physician and our lead infection control officer at Collingwood General Marine Hospital. Dr. Quigg completed his postgraduate training with the University of Toronto and has been part of the CGMH family for over 20 years. He consistently goes above and beyond in his role as a family physician and his role as infection control lead. We are happy to have Dr. Quigg here today to provide an update on the local response to COVID-19.
morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Quigg. I'm the head of infection control here at Collingwood General and Marine Hospital. And this talk is a little description of how we're taking on COVID-19. The South Georgian Bay COVID-19 response, in fact, started earlier than in many other communities. Before most hospitals realized there was an issue, our Chief of Staff, Dr. Michael Lisi, noticed the reports coming out of China about possible new cases of pneumonia and started asking questions about our preparedness. In spite of being told not to worry, he kept focused on the issue, and as the storm gathered, working together with our hospital and community healthcare staff, mobilized resources to develop solutions to the challenge. Next slide.
I don't think I can get her to do it. You mean it'll be very well? This is not mission difficult, Mr. Hunt. It's mission impossible. Difficult should be a walk in the park for you.
Getting a small, under-resourced 60-year-old hospital that was already bursting at the seams in a population that had multiple risk factors for COVID-19, ready for the biggest pandemic since 1918, seemed at first glance actually mission impossible. But one of our slogans in the South Georgian Bay area is that we're doing it here. So our staff set out to prove that we live up to our motto. We only had one very small and adequate negative pressure room in our ER. So our ER docs, nurses, and admin, working with our fantastic facilities and maintenance people, converted our old trauma bays in ER into negative pressure zones suitable for COVID patients. At a small hospital, or as a small hospital, we usually transfer a lot of critically ill patients out. But with the pandemic, we knew that wasn't always going to be possible. And so we had to increase our ICU beds. At UHN or Sunnybrook, that involved doing something like converting a surgical ICU bed into a regular ICU bed, requiring a few changes. In our hospital, it involved taking a regular hospital room, first partially rebuilding the room to make it into a negative pressure space, finding a ventilator, and all the other equipment needed in the middle of a worldwide shortage, and only then converting it to a proper ICU room. As a hospital that normally keeps no more than 2 patients on a ventilator at any one time, we had to figure out how to ventilate up to a maximum of 7 patients at the same time. Our awesome GP&Istas spent many sleepless nights reviewing the latest information from Wuhan, Italy, and New York, and adapting it to our local circumstances. In the end, with help from administration and a multidisciplinary team, they were able to expand our ICU capacity to over triple what it was in just a few months. After watching the stress that people in the community as well as healthcare providers were experiencing in places like Italy and New York, our mental health service didn't wait to be asked for help. They simply started doing it here. Since the start of the crisis, they developed a 2-pronged approach to reach out to both the most vulnerable populations in our community that are under extreme emotional and economic stress from COVID, but also the healthcare providers who need to be there to care for them, who themselves are facing unprecedented personal and professional challenges as a result of the pandemic. This is Dr. Elkhausen doing her shift in what we call the COVID Army, which she, Dr. Plume, and several other family physicians and hospitalists organized to come to grips with the crisis. We're a family practice hospital, which normally, where normally on the order of 25 family physicians will round on their patients daily. To minimize the use of scarce PPE and to reduce the risk of nosocomial spread of COVID, the entire family practice department, working with our hospitalists, literally turned on a dime and completely revamped itself to meet the needs of the emergency. Speaking of PPE, unlike other larger hospitals that have warehouses full of supplies, as a small hospital with little storage capacity, we rely on just-in-time ordering. As a result, we got hit harder by the PPE shortage at the beginning of the crisis compared to a lot of bigger institutions. What we had, however, was an awesome group of communities in our catchment area that came to our rescue. Local professionals, businesses, and community groups stepped forward donating PPE. Individuals leveraged business contacts all over the world to obtain supplies. People ordered PPE on Amazon and donated it. It was truly magical watching our storage rooms fill up. As many of you know, Collingwood is the home of the Rural Ontario Medical Program, founded almost 30 years ago by Dr. Peter Wells. To show you the kind of amazing residents and healthcare students ROMP attracts, This is a photo of ROMP resident Dr. Alex Pierce, helping to organize local youth who volunteered to use 3D printers to make critically needed face shields and other PPE supplies. When we ran desperately short of protective gowns, a group of local seamstresses got together and with the help of the Collingwood Hospital Foundation, handmade hundreds of isolation gowns for our staff. This is a picture of our local Royal Canadian Legion. As you can see, Monday Night Bingo is canceled, but it's canceled for a reason you might not expect. As I mentioned earlier, our old hospital is critically short of space with no unused wards or large areas that could be converted to bed spaces for overflow COVID patients. This has taken a tremendous amount of work. Once again, the community came through and has let us turn the local Legion into an alternative health facility that can care for up to 30 COVID patients. This has taken a tremendous amount of work done in record time by a multidisciplinary group led by Nora Holder and the admin team. If Nora's listening today, though, I do have to tell you that there are rumors that our lead physician, Dr. Brian Rakowski, has promised us all a beer served on the spot for every patient discharged. And speaking of community partners, our family health team and CHC organized to help. The Drive-Through COVID Community Assessment Center is a joint project of the Georgian Bay Family Health Team and the Collingwood Hospital. Under the direction of Dr. Harry O'Halloran and Marie LaRose, our awesome FIT executive director, our fantastic nurse practitioners working with physicians have done over 5,000 COVID swabs at the center and as flying squads that travel out to swab long-term care homes in our area. Although many of the MD shifts at the assessment center are filled by family physicians, many of our orthopedic surgeons, anesthetists, and obstetricians have stepped up to the plate and taken shifts in the COVID tent, as we call it, doing the swabs. Everybody's pulled together. It's been a total team effort. This is a CBC clip of our COVID assessment center in operation. It appeared in a longer version on the CBC's The National. You can play it, please.
Looks like you got a customer here.
Getting tested isn't optional for these guys. Logan Crawley and Jamie Vu need a clean bill of health before they can get back to work at a long-term care home.
I understand that you both did test positive?
Yeah.
And did you have any symptoms, or?
Yeah, so I had like night sweats, so like fevers throughout the night, headaches, chills.
How long ago was that?
Probably a week and a half ago now.
36.9.
Do you know if you've passed it on to anyone else?
Well, my family, everyone's doing okay. My dad, it's a little like worrying, like even like just like trying to remember like who you've been with and who have you talked with.
Okay, so they'll be back tomorrow, Aaron? Or? Yeah. Okay, take care, guys.
It turns out they're both still positive and will be tested again in a few days. Jonathan Gatehouse, CBC News, Collingwood, Ontario.
That was Dr. Karen Euler and Aaron Churchill, one of our awesome NPs, doing that. What I want to point out to you is that what doesn't come out in this shortened clip, there was more on the National, was that Logan was one of our Georgian College nursing students who volunteered to work in a nursing home south of us that had a severe COVID outbreak. When the CBC reporter commented it must be hard to keep coming back to get uncomfortable nasopharyngeal swabs multiple times, he responded that he had to keep coming back until he got 2 negative swabs so he could be cleared to work. And in his words, get back in the fight. Logan exemplifies the kind of amazing young healthcare providers we have in this community. We're also working closely with our first responder colleagues in a number of areas. Collaborating with them, the hospital, the family health team, and home care, we're developing a program for home oxygen saturation monitoring for early detection and treatment of any dangerously low oxygen levels or so-called silent hypoxia that COVID patients could be developing after ER or hospital discharge. Here, our wonderful community first responders are staging a drive-by to show their support for our frontline staff. To sum up, as we face the likely prospect of a second wave of infection coming in the fall, COVID-19 is probably the biggest challenge our healthcare community here in South Georgian Bay will face in our lifetimes. We may have an old building and limited resources, but we are doing it here because we have amazing people and the most supportive communities you will find anywhere in Ontario. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Quigg. That was a great presentation. And maybe if you can unshare the screen for Dr. Quigg, we can see him there. Great. Great. Thanks, Mark. So a question here. Do you foresee any particular challenges for the second wave that's coming for the COVID situation as it approaches potentially in the fall?
The second wave is going to be difficult. One message I really want to get across that Dr. Morris mentioned is the reason I'm wearing this is that we need universal masking, particularly in indoor places in this province. That's the most important thing we can do to blunt this. And the Medical Officer of Health and Guelph, Dr. Nikki Mercer, has already made that mandatory, and we need to make that mandatory across the province.
That's great. Thank you. And which successes potentially locally do you feel made a significant difference to our successes dealing with the coronavirus here locally?
I think what made our effort a success was our fantastic people. Everybody came together. Doctors, nurses, our maintenance people, our family health team, our community groups, that storage room full of PPE just sums it right up. The seamstresses, the list goes on. We have an amazing community of people that I think, as Dr. Booth said earlier, people pulled together and worked together. And in spite of older buildings, inadequate resources, everything else, we work together as a community. Which I think all of us can be proud of.
That's great. That's a fantastic way to end this conversation and fantastic way to end our list of speakers. And so I want to thank you, Mark, Dr. Quigg, for all of your great work and for this presentation and for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you for your leadership.
So at this point, I'll take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining us today for our first exclusively live streamed Research and Innovation Day. Such a different year not seeing all of you in person. We hope that as over 250 delegates registered today, you have enjoyed watching our live stream format and the variety of our fantastic speakers. Again, I'd like to thank our incredible speakers who are joining us from all around the region and the world. Thank you for sharing your expertise and unique perspectives. Thank you to our partner organizations who have brought you the South Georgian Bay Research Day. All presented on our backdrop. You can see our team members, in addition to our team here at CGMH who have continued with our innovation and the live stream technology. Thank you. This day involved 10 health professional students who have worked so hard behind the scenes in organizing and supporting another successful Research and Innovation Day. Research posters will continue to be available for viewing on the Collingwood General and Marine Hospital and Rural Ontario Medical Program websites. You can see those listed on your screen. Today's sessions are recorded, so if you or your colleagues or neighbors would like to watch the presentations today and other videos from the community, these recordings will be posted right where you have found the live stream link. The links, again, maybe we can put those back up on the screen for the folks. We hope that you will join us next year in our usual format of in-person and live stream for our 6th annual Georgian Bay Healthcare Wellness, Research and Innovation Day. Thank you all. Take care. Awesome, guys. That's great.